The stage was set. The lights were blinding, the cameras rolling, and the sound of the audience's excited murmurs echoed in the studio. The host, Brad Turner, stood confidently at the center of the set, his perfectly tailored suit gleaming under the lights. He had built a career on his ability to provoke, his sharp tongue the weapon he wielded to make headlines. Tonight was supposed to be no different. His guest was none other than Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, Hollywood's most bankable star, a man known for his charm, charisma, and above all, his sense of humor. Brad grinned as the applause grew louder, and the audience settled into an almost palpable anticipation. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth and practiced, "tonight's guest needs no introduction. He's an icon, a legend, a man who went from the wrestling ring to the silver screen to become one of the most beloved figures in entertainment. Please welcome Dwayne Johnson." The crowd erupted in cheers, and Dwayne stepped onto the stage, his presence filling the room. He was dressed casually, jeans, a simple t-shirt, and his signature smile that made everyone feel like he was just one of the guys. His confidence radiated, but there was something different about the way he carried himself tonight. He was calm, almost too calm, and there was a certain gleam in his eye, a spark that said he was more than ready for whatever Brad was about to throw at him. As Dwayne took his seat across from Brad, the audience settled into a comfortable silence, waiting for the exchange that was sure to be electric. Brad's eyes glinted with mischief. He wasn't just any talk show host. He prided himself on his ability to goad celebrities into making mistakes, to push them into uncomfortable corners. And he had been waiting for this moment. He had been planning it all week. Dwayne, the big, tough guy with all his Hollywood charm, was about to meet his match. "So, Dwayne," Brad began, leaning forward, his tone casual, but with an edge of something else, something sharper. "You've made a career out of playing tough guys on the big screen. But let's talk about something a little less glamorous. You're known for being pretty vocal about your political views. Now, I have to ask, how do you reconcile being this all-American icon while also being someone who's spoken out against some of the very things this country stands for?" The audience fell silent. It was the kind of question that could set the tone for the entire interview, and Brad was ready to watch Dwayne squirm. He had studied his guest's past comments, waiting for the perfect opportunity to hit him with the kind of bait he wouldn't be able to resist. Dwayne's smile didn't falter. If anything, it widened slightly. His jaw clenched, but only for a moment, before he leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms in a relaxed yet controlled posture. "I think you're giving me a little too much credit, Brad," Dwayne replied, his voice smooth and calm. "I'm just a guy who believes in fairness. And if that means speaking out on issues that matter to me, whether it's politics or anything else, then I'm going to do it. Doesn't make me less of an American, though. It just makes me a guy who thinks." Brad's grin flickered for a split second. He had expected Dwayne to take the bait and dive into the heated waters of political debate. But instead, Dwayne had come out swinging with a response that was as sharp as it was diplomatic. Still, Brad wasn't about to let him off that easy. "Fairness," Brad repeated, as if testing the word on his tongue. "So, you'd say you're the voice of reason, huh? You know, some would argue that your opinions are a little, let's say, out there. Not exactly the voice of moderation that people expect from someone like you. I mean, you're a wrestler turned movie star. That's not exactly the voice of reason, right?" Dwayne's expression didn't change. He didn't flinch, didn't react. It was as if he had expected this moment, this kind of conversation, to come. And now, he was ready to shut it down. "Brad, I've never pretended to be anything other than who I am," Dwayne said, his voice now laced with just a hint of amusement. "If you want me to sit here and pretend that I'm just some action movie star who doesn't care about what happens in the world, you've got the wrong guy. But if you think I'm going to take the bait and get into a political argument with you, that's not happening." The audience shifted, unsure whether they should laugh, cheer, or sit back and watch. Dwayne had just played his cards in a way that no one expected, not just with a witty comment, but with a calm confidence that took the wind right out of Brad's sails. Brad's face tightened, his smile slipping ever so slightly. But this was his show, and he wasn't going to let Dwayne control the narrative so easily. "Oh, don't worry, Dwayne," Brad replied, leaning back in his chair. I'm not trying to get you to fight my battles. But you've got to admit the things you've said. Before Brad could finish, Dwayne raised a hand, cutting him off. The audience watched in awe as Dwayne's calm demeanor turned into something more playful, almost teasing. Brad, listen, Dwayne said, shaking his head with a smile. I get it. You want to fight. You want a heated debate, some fireworks. But here's the thing. I'm not here for that. I'm here to laugh, to have a good time, and to let people see the real me, without all the politics, without all the noise. So, how about we just have some fun, huh? For a moment, there was silence. Brad's eyebrows furrowed, a flicker of frustration crossing his face. But Dwayne's response had landed. The audience was with him. They weren't here for another political shouting match. They were here to see the man who could juggle action movies, wrestling, and philanthropy with the same effortless smile. And for the first time that night, they realized they weren't going to get the show they had expected. Brad knew this interview wasn't going to go the way he had planned. But he wasn't about to give up just yet. The game was still on. Dwayne looked directly at the camera, his smile widening as he spoke, his voice full of humor. All right, audience, he said, hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The tension was palpable, and the moment hung in the air like the calm before the storm. Brad could feel it. The audience could feel it. The game had only just begun. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Before he became The Rock, before he dominated the silver screen and the WWE ring, Dwayne Johnson was just a kid trying to find his place in the world. Born in Hayward, California, in 1972, he was the son of professional wrestler Rocky Johnson and his wife, Adam Ivaya, a Samoan-American family with wrestling running deep in their veins. From the very beginning, Dwayne's life was destined for the spotlight, but it wasn't always glamorous. It was often filled with struggle, uncertainty, and hard lessons. Dwayne remembers the early years as a whirlwind of change. His parents' marriage didn't last, and he found himself moving from place to place, struggling to fit in. As a child, he didn't quite have the name recognition that would later make him famous, and he often found himself on the outside looking in. He was bigger than most kids his age, which led to both admiration and fear. But for Dwayne, being the biggest kid wasn't always the greatest advantage. It made him a target for bullies. I wasn't always the most popular, Dwayne admitted in an interview years later. I didn't fit in, and that sucked, man. I got picked on a lot. Just because I looked different, I was too big, or I didn't have the same things that the other kids had. Dwayne's early years were marked by feelings of isolation, but he was determined to overcome them. His love of sports helped him channel his frustrations, and by the time he was in high school, he was excelling in football, basketball, and track. He was a natural athlete, and that became his ticket to a better life. Despite the personal struggles, he thrived in sports, and soon enough, the attention he had once longed for began to follow him. But Dwayne wasn't just an athlete. He was a son. His father, Rocky Johnson, had a complex relationship with him, shaped by the pressures of being a professional wrestler. While Rocky was a legendary figure in his own right, he wasn't always around for Dwayne, especially after the divorce. Dwayne grew up knowing the sacrifices his father had made, but he also learned early on that love could sometimes be expressed in unexpected ways. I didn't always understand it when I was younger, Dwayne once said, reflecting on his father's tough love. My dad didn't tell me he loved me every day. He showed me, and that meant a lot. It's tough to be a kid growing up, but you learn to appreciate those quiet lessons. At the University of Miami, Dwayne's athleticism continued to shine, especially on the football field. He was a defensive lineman, a powerhouse on the gridiron. The dreams of making it to the NFL seemed within reach, but fate had other plans. A serious back injury derailed his professional football aspirations, leaving him at a crossroads. For a brief time, Dwayne was lost, unsure of his future. It was a moment that would change everything, but it wasn't the end of his journey. It was just the beginning of something far bigger. While recovering from his injury, Dwayne found himself drawn to the world of wrestling. His family's history in the sport beckoned him, and after meeting with WWE, then WWF, legend Pat Patterson, he decided to take the plunge into the squared circle. It wasn't an easy decision. Wrestling was tough, physically demanding, and full of its own kind of politics. But it felt like destiny, like the right place for him to finally find a true purpose. In 1996, under the ring name Rocky Maivia, Dwayne made his debut in the WWE. The early days were rough. He wasn't immediately embraced by fans who were used to larger-than-life characters like Hulk Hogan and Stone Cold Steve Austin. He was labeled a blue chipper, a rookie with too much hype. But Dwayne was used to fighting for what he wanted. He wasn't going to be another flash in the pan. His break came when he reinvented himself as The Rock, a cocky, trash-talking, electrifying personality that quickly became a fan favorite. The Rock wasn't just a wrestler. He was a force of nature, an entertainer who could back up every boast with a well-placed move in the ring. He exuded confidence, an attribute he would carry with him off the mat, into Hollywood, and even into the world of politics. His rise in WWE was meteoric, and with it came the fame he had once dreamed of but never expected. Yet, despite his newfound success, Dwayne remained grounded. He knew where he had come from, and he never lost sight of the values that shaped him: hard work, resilience, and humility. When Dwayne eventually transitioned into Hollywood, the same qualities that made him a wrestling superstar helped him carve a new path. His first few movies, like The Scorpion King, were far from blockbusters, but he kept pushing. He took on roles that allowed him to showcase both his physicality and his charisma, gradually proving himself as more than just an action hero. He became a global box office draw, starring in films like Fast and Furious and Jumanji. But no matter how far he went, he never forgot where he came from. The struggles he faced as a kid, the bullying, the pressure from his father, and the disappointment of a shattered football career. All of it was a part of the story that shaped him. As Dwayne's career skyrocketed, he became more than just an actor or a wrestler. He became a cultural icon, someone who represented strength, perseverance, and, most importantly, authenticity. In a world that often seemed full of facades, Dwayne was refreshingly real. His social media presence, filled with motivational posts and glimpses into his personal life, made him relatable to millions. He wasn't just a movie star. He was the guy next door who had worked hard to get where he was, and he wanted everyone to know that it was possible for them too. But through all his fame, fortune, and success, Dwayne never lost sight of the one thing that kept him grounded: his family. His wife, Lauren, and their children were the anchors in his life, and they were a constant reminder that while the world may change, some things, like love, loyalty, and family, never do. And now, here he was, sitting on this talk show stage, facing down a liberal TV host who was about to try and bait him into a political confrontation. But Dwayne had seen much worse in his life. He'd been in the ring with some of the toughest competitors in the world, faced off with critics who doubted him, and overcome every obstacle life had thrown his way. This interview was just another challenge, one he was more than ready to face. As Brad Turner sat across from him, still trying to provoke him into an argument, Dwayne couldn't help but feel a sense of calm. He had faced tougher battles than this, both inside and outside the ring, and he knew that tonight, just like every other moment in his life, he was going to rise to the occasion. Brad Turner sat across from Dwayne, trying to conceal his growing frustration behind a practiced smile. It was clear that his earlier attempt to spark a fiery debate had fallen flat, and now he was scrambling for a new angle. He had expected Dwayne to be rattled, to at least show some signs of discomfort when confronted with such a blunt question about his political views. But no, Dwayne had dodged the bullet with ease, and now Brad was left with a feeling of unfulfilled ambition. He needed a way to get under Dwayne's skin. He needed to make the interview memorable, provocative. "So, Dwayne," Brad said, forcing a light chuckle, "I gotta ask. You've been pretty vocal about supporting some progressive causes, things like climate change, inequality, and the need for political reform. Yet, you're also someone who's made millions in Hollywood and, well, let's be honest, you don't exactly live a life of austerity. How do you reconcile those two worlds?" Dwayne's expression didn't change. He was the picture of calm, his posture still relaxed, his hands resting comfortably on his lap. He leaned in slightly, his voice even as he replied, "Brad, I think you're mixing two things here. I don't speak out against success or against people who've made it. What I do speak out against is injustice, inequality, and the things that hold people back, especially those who don't have the same opportunities. You can be successful and still care about making the world a better place. But I don't expect you to get that. It's easy to sit in your chair and criticize from the sidelines." The audience seemed to shift, a slight murmur of approval running through the room. Dwayne's response was measured, his tone calm yet firm. It wasn't an answer that played into Brad's narrative, and that left Brad visibly irritated. He was used to being the one in control, used to calling the shots. But here was this former wrestler turned actor, sitting across from him with a level of confidence that Brad couldn't seem to crack. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the next line of questioning. If he couldn't get Dwayne to engage on politics, he would try another approach, one that targeted Dwayne's image, the very thing that made him a Hollywood star. "You know, Dwayne," Brad began, his tone shifting, "for all the talk about fairness, you've built a career off the backs of the very system that creates the inequality you're so passionate about. Hollywood, the entertainment industry, they're all built on exclusivity, on gatekeepers who control the narrative. So, how do you justify playing in that sandbox when you know it's part of the problem?" Dwayne's eyes flashed for just a moment. The question was more pointed, more personal, but he didn't flinch. If anything, there was a subtle smirk on his face as he met Brad's gaze. "Let me ask you something, Brad," Dwayne replied, his voice still smooth but carrying a hint of challenge. "You're sitting here in front of me, asking me these questions, trying to push me into some box. But what are you doing with your platform? You've got an audience, a microphone. Are you just going to keep poking at people like me to get views? Or are you going to use your position to actually change something?" Brad was taken aback by the sudden turn of the conversation. For a split second, he had no response. He wasn't used to being called out like this, especially not by a guest. But he quickly recovered, shifting back into his role as the provocateur. "Touché, Dwayne," Brad said, his voice tinged with mock appreciation. "But here's the thing. You've built an empire. You're worth hundreds of millions of dollars. You've created your own narrative, your own brand. How does that not make you part of the problem? You've bought into the very system that keeps the rest of us down. Isn't that a little hypocritical?" There it was. Brad's most direct shot yet. He was finally getting to Dwayne's core, at least, he thought so. The question was loaded, calculated. It was designed to make Dwayne squirm, to put him in the uncomfortable position of defending the very system that had made him wealthy and famous. Dwayne's smile never wavered. If anything, it deepened, almost as if he found Brad's antics more amusing than infuriating. He leaned forward slightly, his voice quieter now, more intimate. "Brad, you don't understand. It's not about the money or the fame. That stuff, it comes and goes. The real value is in how you use your platform, how you use your voice to elevate others. I don't sit here and tell people they can't be successful. I show them how to do it. You think because I've made it, I'm somehow complicit in the system? No, I use my position to change it." The audience was quiet now, hanging on every word. Dwayne wasn't just speaking to Brad anymore. He was speaking to them, and they could feel the weight of his words. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't a defense. It was confidence, confidence in his purpose, in his mission. Brad's expression faltered, just for a second. He had expected Dwayne to become defensive, to lose his cool and stumble into a trap. But that wasn't happening. Instead, Dwayne was flipping the script, turning the entire conversation back on him. But Brad wasn't about to let this moment slip by. He had one last card to play, one final attempt to regain control of the narrative. "All right, Dwayne," Brad said, leaning forward with a sly smile. "Let's talk about that then. You've said you want to make things better, to change the system. But you've also been pretty vocal about how much you love the status quo. Hollywood, the system that rewards you for being a brand. So, here's my question. Are you really about change? Or are you just another celebrity trying to keep the spotlight on yourself while telling everyone else how to live?" Dwayne sat back, his expression unreadable. He knew Brad was trying to bait him, trying to push him to make a statement that would blow up in his face. But Dwayne wasn't like the celebrities Brad was used to. He wasn't going to fall into that trap. He had been in the ring with some of the toughest competitors, and he had learned how to control the fight. Tonight would be no different. He looked at Brad, then at the camera, and for the first time, he spoke directly to the audience, his voice calm and deliberate. Brad, here's the thing. You can twist my words all you want. You can try to frame me however you like. But the truth is, I'm here to inspire people, to show them that no matter where they start, no matter the obstacles in their way, they can achieve greatness. And if that means using the platform I've earned to speak up, to challenge the status quo, then that's exactly what I'll do. The studio was silent. For a moment, even Brad seemed to pause, as if the force of Dwayne's words had finally hit him. The audience was still, hanging on every word, waiting for the next move. It was clear now. This wasn't just a talk show. This was a battle of wills, and Dwayne was in complete control. The air in the studio had thickened. What started as a casual interview had now turned into a high-stakes showdown. Brad Turner, the once confident TV host, was now visibly rattled. He had hoped to catch Dwayne off guard, to provoke him into making a mistake. But as each question slipped from his lips, it became clear that Dwayne was not just playing the game. He was rewriting the rules. The audience, who had been quietly observing up to this point, now seemed more engaged. Eyes flicked between Brad and Dwayne as if they were watching a chess match unfold. Each move deliberate, each counterpunch delivered with precision. There was something magnetic about Dwayne's presence. It wasn't just his physicality. It was his aura, the way he owned every room he walked into. Brad, growing increasingly desperate, leaned forward once more. His next question was his final attempt to regain control of the conversation, to steer it back into familiar territory. He knew this was make or break. You keep saying you want to inspire people, Dwayne, Brad began, his voice laced with a false air of respect. But let's be real for a moment. You're in Hollywood. You're a billionaire businessman. Your Instagram posts are all about self-help and motivation, but when it comes down to it, aren't you just profiting off the same system that's leaving so many people behind? The question landed like a punch in the gut. It wasn't just an attack on Dwayne's career. It was an attack on his character. Brad was going for the jugular, trying to paint Dwayne as a hypocrite, someone who preached about change but wasn't walking the talk. For a moment, Dwayne didn't respond. He just stared at Brad, letting the silence fill the air. It was a power play, one that made the entire studio hold its breath. Brad shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but Dwayne remained still, unflinching. It was as if the world around him had slowed down, and he was about to make a move that would change the game forever. Finally, Dwayne spoke, his voice calm, but with an intensity that sent a ripple of energy through the room. You know, Brad, I don't mind you asking tough questions. I don't mind being challenged. But here's the thing you're missing. Yeah, I've worked hard to get where I am. I've built something for myself, but that doesn't mean I've turned my back on anyone else. Far from it. Dwayne leaned forward now, his eyes locked on Brad's. You talk about the system like it's this thing I'm supposed to bow down to, but I don't bow to anyone. I didn't get here by playing by the rules. I got here by breaking them, by pushing against the grain, by showing up every single day and doing the work. That's what the people who truly make a difference do. They show up. They don't sit around pointing fingers. They get in the trenches, they fight for what's right, and they lift others as they rise. The studio audience was on the edge of their seats now. Dwayne wasn't just answering questions. He was preaching a message, delivering a powerful speech that hit home on a level that was impossible to ignore. Brad's face twisted for a moment, a mix of irritation and disbelief. So, you're telling me you've built an empire, Hollywood, your own brand, your businesses, and none of that makes you part of the system you claim to oppose? No, Dwayne said, his voice unwavering. I'm telling you that I've used the system to make a change. That's the difference. I've seen how hard it is to break through. How many people with real talent get overlooked, shut out, or ignored. That's what needs to change. There was a shift in the air. The conversation, once full of tension, was now taking on a weight that seemed to transcend the show itself. It wasn't just an argument anymore. It was a declaration, a challenge. Brad tried to regain his footing, but the words came out more weakly than he intended. But what about the people who don't have the opportunity you had, who don't get the chance to rise? What about the people who don't have a platform like yours to make a difference? Dwayne's expression softened, but there was a steeliness behind his gaze. Brad, I know what it's like to struggle. I know what it's like to be told you're not enough. I've lived that. But I also know that no matter where you come from, you can always fight. You can always find a way. And that's what I want people to understand. The world may not always play fair, but that doesn't mean we have to play by its rules. There was a brief silence in the studio as Dwayne's words sank in. Brad, for the first time in the interview, didn't have an immediate comeback. His next question died on his lips, and for a moment, it seemed like the entire world was watching him struggle to regain his composure. But Dwayne wasn't done. This wasn't just a moment for him to defend himself. It was a moment to challenge everyone in that room, everyone watching at home, to rethink their perspective. Look, Brad, Dwayne continued, I didn't get here because of luck. I didn't just show up and expect things to fall into my lap. I worked for every inch I've gained. But here's the thing I've learned. When you make it, you don't get to just enjoy the ride. You've got to turn around and pull people up with you. Brad was now at a loss for words. The tide had shifted completely, and he was no longer the one steering the conversation. Dwayne had taken control, turning the tables with an eloquence that no one saw coming. The audience was silent, almost reverent, as Dwayne spoke from the heart. His sincerity, his unshakable belief in his message, it was undeniable. This wasn't the interview Brad had planned. This wasn't the story he had hoped to tell. No, Dwayne Johnson had turned this into something bigger, something that couldn't be dismissed with a clever soundbite. Dwayne stood up, now addressing the entire room, the cameras, the viewers at home. I'm not just here to entertain you, Brad. I'm here to show you that change is possible. But it's not going to happen by sitting on the sidelines and criticizing. It happens when people like me, like all of us, step up, take responsibility, and use what we have to make a difference. And with that, Dwayne Johnson didn't just answer Brad's questions. He took the spotlight, redirected it, and used it to spark something much bigger than the debate they had started. The audience erupted into applause. Brad, looking flustered and defeated, could only manage a half-hearted grin. He had underestimated Dwayne, and in that moment, it was clear to everyone watching that the real winner of this interview wasn't Brad Turner. It was Dwayne Johnson. The applause from the audience was thunderous, but it wasn't just for the words Dwayne had spoken. It wasn't the usual polite clapping of people caught in the middle of a scripted show. No, this was genuine. It was the kind of applause that followed a moment of real clarity, a shift in the air that everyone in that room felt. Brad Turner, still sitting behind his desk, was almost frozen. His smile had faded, replaced by an expression that was a mixture of disbelief and frustration. He wasn't prepared for this. He wasn't prepared for Dwayne to flip the interview on its head so thoroughly. For a moment, the camera caught Brad's hand shaking slightly as he reached for his notes. He glanced at the prompter, but his usual lines seemed inadequate now. There was no rehearsed comeback, no easy snark to throw at the man sitting across from him, the man who had just turned the entire narrative into something that demanded reflection. Dwayne, still standing, glanced around the studio, making eye contact with the audience members who were visibly moved. Some were nodding, some were smiling, some were even wiping tears from their eyes. And in that moment, Dwayne knew that this wasn't just about him anymore. It wasn't about defending himself against Brad's probing questions. This was about something far bigger, the chance to make an impact, to speak for those who didn't have a voice, and to show that change was possible if you were willing to fight for it. He finally sat back down, his posture relaxed but still commanding. Brad, Dwayne said, his tone shifting, softer now, almost compassionate. I didn't come here to make you look bad. I didn't come here to play a game. I came here to talk about something real, something that matters. Brad swallowed hard, the weight of Dwayne's words pressing down on him. He cleared his throat, his voice shaky as he tried to regain his bearings. Yeah, well, I didn't expect that, he muttered, forcing a laugh. You really came prepared, huh? Dwayne smiled, but it wasn't the typical Hollywood smile that graced magazine covers or red carpets. This one was different. This was a smile of understanding, of wisdom earned over years of struggles and triumphs. "I didn't come here to win, Brad," Dwayne said, his voice low but strong. "I came here to tell the truth. And I think we both know that's what this show needs more of." For a moment, Brad stared at Dwayne. He had no snappy retort, no rebuttal to Dwayne's message. The cameras were still rolling, the audience was still watching, and the magnitude of what had just happened was slowly starting to sink in. Brad had attempted to provoke a confrontation, a drama that could have gone viral. Instead, he had been outplayed, outspoken, outclassed. The tension in the room thickened as Dwayne leaned in slightly, his eyes never leaving the camera. "And here's the thing," he continued. "The people out there, watching at home, they want to see authenticity. They want to see real conversations. They want to know that there's something beyond the headlines and the politics and the ratings. They want to know that there's hope." There was a shift in the energy now. The audience, initially unsure of where this was heading, was now fully invested. Dwayne wasn't just speaking to Brad or the crew. He was speaking to the millions watching at home, the ones who had seen celebrities come and go, the ones who had watched politicians and pundits spin their stories on cable news. But Dwayne wasn't here to spin a story. He was here to tell the truth. And in doing so, he had captured the hearts and minds of the people. Brad sat back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he tried to compose himself. He wasn't ready for this level of honesty. He wasn't ready for the vulnerability Dwayne had put on display. It was something he had never seen on his own show. It was raw, unapologetic, and it was powerful. The camera panned to the audience, capturing their reactions, smiles, tears, nods of agreement. It was as if Dwayne had tapped into something deep inside them, something that had been simmering for a long time but had never been articulated in such a simple yet profound way. "Brad, you can sit here and try to make me look bad, but the truth is, I don't have time for that," Dwayne said, his voice growing stronger. "I've got a platform, I've got a voice, and I'm going to use it for something that matters. I'm going to use it to tell people that they don't have to settle. They don't have to wait for permission to make their dreams come true. They don't have to sit back and accept things the way they are." The audience erupted in applause again, but this time, it wasn't just for Dwayne's words. It was for the truth he had spoken, for the reminder that change was possible, that in the face of adversity, there was always a way forward, a way to rise above the challenges that life threw at you. Brad, realizing the interview had slipped beyond his control, tried to keep the conversation moving, but it was clear the energy in the room had shifted. The dynamic had changed. What had been a combative, confrontational exchange was now a moment of clarity. Dwayne Johnson wasn't just a celebrity, a former wrestler turned actor. He was a voice of reason, a voice of hope. And in that moment, everyone could see it. For the first time in his career, Brad Turner found himself speechless. He had underestimated his guest, and the magnitude of the situation had caught up with him. Dwayne sat back, his gaze never leaving the camera. "I want to leave everyone watching with this," he said, his voice firm yet sincere. "You can either sit back and let the world tell you what's possible, or you can stand up and show the world what's possible. The choice is yours." The applause that followed was deafening. But for Dwayne, it wasn't about the applause. It wasn't about winning. It was about making a difference. And in this moment, he had done exactly that. As the camera zoomed out, capturing the stillness in the room, Brad sat back, defeated. He had set out to destroy Dwayne, but instead, he had witnessed something he could never have predicted. A shift in the conversation, a moment of truth that would resonate far beyond the studio. And as the credits began to roll, the audience knew that this was no ordinary interview. This was a moment that would leave a lasting impact, a moment when the line between celebrity and activist, between Hollywood and reality, was forever blurred. The cameras had stopped rolling, but the energy in the studio remained palpable. There was a rare sense of silence as everyone slowly came to terms with what had just unfolded. It wasn't the usual end to a broadcast interview. It wasn't the typical mix of banter and scripted conclusions. No, this was different. Dwayne Johnson had done more than answer questions. He had made a statement. And as the last shot of him walking off the stage was captured, people were left not with the image of a Hollywood star, but with the image of someone who had just used his platform for something far more significant than fame or fortune. The crew began to move, but the energy in the room was still thick. It was as though time itself had stretched, giving the moment space to breathe. Brad Turner sat back in his chair, hands on his lap, staring at the empty chair across from him where Dwayne had just been. His face had softened, no longer the sharp, cocky mask he had worn when the interview started. He didn't know what to feel. A part of him was still stunned by the exchange, Dwayne's confidence, his conviction, but another part of him was beginning to understand something. This wasn't just a loss in the ratings war. This was a loss in the battle for truth. When the crew finally began to clear the set, one of the producers approached Brad with a tentative smile. She hesitated, glancing at him for a moment before speaking. "Brad, I think that went better than we expected," she said, a touch of uncertainty in her voice. Brad didn't immediately respond. He stood up, walking toward the glass door that led to the studio's backstage area. His mind was spinning, the rush of adrenaline still buzzing in his chest. He had tried to control the narrative, to manipulate the show for his own gain. But now, it felt as though the story had slipped right out of his hands. He turned to the producer. "Yeah, but not in the way we thought." She raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Brad glanced back at the empty set, then at the monitors where Dwayne's final words were being replayed. That wasn't just an interview. That was a moment, a statement. "I think people are going to be talking about this for a long time." He paused, reflecting. "You know what? He's right. We need more of this. More real, raw conversations. Not just hot takes and political theater." I was too focused on making him look bad, and it backfired. The producer, surprised by his sudden shift, nodded slowly. "It's hard to admit when you've been outplayed." Brad smiled faintly. "I don't think it's about being outplayed. It's about waking up. Maybe I've been so wrapped up in the game that I forgot why we do this in the first place." As the crew continued their cleanup, Brad walked down the hallway to his dressing room. He leaned against the door for a moment, staring out at the bustling crew behind him. Everything felt surreal. For once, the chase for ratings, the need for drama, felt hollow. It wasn't just about sensationalism anymore. He had been a part of something deeper, something that challenged the way he viewed the media and maybe even his role in it. Back at his hotel, Dwayne sat on the edge of his bed, scrolling through his phone. The internet was ablaze with reactions from the interview. Twitter was in overdrive, clips of his final words being shared by millions. Headlines, both supportive and critical, were popping up by the second. Some praised Dwayne for taking down the hostile interviewer and using his platform for good, calling it a rare display of authenticity in an industry too obsessed with celebrity drama. Others, however, took the opposite stance, saying Dwayne had been too evasive, too self-righteous. They claimed he'd evaded the hard questions and turned the interview into a self-serving PR stunt. But for Dwayne, the backlash didn't sting as much as it might have in the past. He had expected some of it. People who didn't understand his perspective, people who weren't ready for the truth. Those voices would always be loud. But the positive reactions far outweighed the negative. The outpouring of support from his fans and from people who felt inspired by his words made it clear. He had done the right thing. It wasn't about the applause. It was about planting a seed of self-belief, a seed of hope. Dwayne leaned back, placing his phone on the bedside table. He reflected on everything that had just happened. The intense moments on set, the way the room had shifted when he spoke, the way he felt in that instant, like he was finally, truly using his voice for something bigger than just entertainment. It had been a risk, opening up like that, letting the cameras see the real him. But he knew it was worth it. The words had come from a place of deep conviction, words that resonated beyond the interview, beyond the show. As the days passed, the ripple effect of the interview continued to unfold. Discussions sparked across social media, news outlets, and even within the entertainment industry. The interview wasn't just remembered. It was dissected, analyzed, and replayed. People were asking, what did Dwayne's words mean for them? How could they take his message of authenticity and self-empowerment into their own lives? Was it possible to overcome the systems that seemed to hold them back? Could they, too, break free from the limiting beliefs that kept them stuck? For Dwayne, It wasn't just about changing minds in the short term. It was about sparking a movement, a shift in the cultural conversation. He wasn't trying to start a war or fight against a single person. He was fighting for a greater cause, the cause of being real, of not letting the world dictate who you should be. The interview had started with tension and conflict, but it had ended with something far more powerful, a message that would continue to resonate in the hearts and minds of the audience long after the cameras had stopped rolling. And in the quiet moments, when Dwayne looked back on everything, he knew this was more than just an interview. It was a turning point, not just for him, but for everyone who had been touched by it. The days following the interview were a whirlwind. Dwayne's phone never stopped buzzing. Every time he checked his messages, there was a new wave of reactions from fans, fellow celebrities, political commentators, and even people he had never met. It was as if the world had suddenly stopped what it was doing and focused all its attention on that one interview, that one moment. Dwayne didn't know if it was the fame, the raw honesty, or just the right time. But whatever it was hitting people hard. And that felt good. He sat at his kitchen table, sipping a cup of coffee as he scanned the headlines. Dwayne Johnson shakes up TV with bold response to liberal host, one headline read. Another article called it, the interview that changed everything. Comments flooded in on social media, some praising Dwayne for finally speaking out, others criticizing him for not answering the tough questions. But the overwhelming sentiment was clear. People wanted more of this. They were tired of the same scripted political back and forth. They were hungry for authenticity, for someone who would speak from the heart. But it wasn't just the media that had noticed. The interview had gone viral for a reason. People were talking about it in coffee shops, at family dinners, in offices across the country. Dwayne could feel it in the air. Something had shifted. The conversation wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had been pushed aside by the noise of the mainstream media. It was about everyday people who felt their voices were drowned out by sensationalism. But not everyone was excited about the new wave of conversation. Across town, Brad Turner was in his own spiral of reflection, though his experience was far from positive. It had been a few days since the interview, and the repercussions were already starting to hit Brad. The social media backlash was swift and brutal. Some people praised Dwayne for standing his ground, and some even went so far as to say that Brad had been destroyed on live TV. The hashtag #DwayneOne was trending all over Twitter, and Brad was being mocked in meme after meme. It wasn't just the fans and viewers, either. His colleagues in the industry were giving him sideways looks. Producers who once respected him were beginning to question his credibility. How could a seasoned TV host like Brad have let someone like Dwayne Johnson turn the tables on him so thoroughly? It wasn't just a loss in ratings. It was a loss of control, a loss of face. Brad was sitting in his office, staring at his computer screen. The comments from his latest post were rolling in, most of them negative. "You got schooled by The Rock," one comment read. Another one simply said, "Embarrassing." His phone buzzed. It was a message from his manager, Sarah, asking if he was okay. He took a deep breath before responding, but the truth was, he wasn't sure if he was okay. What had started as a calculated, high-profile interview had backfired in a way he never imagined. There was a knock at the door. Sarah stepped in, her face betraying the concern she had clearly been trying to mask. "Brad, we need to talk," she said softly, taking a seat across from him. He didn't look up, still staring at the screen. "I know. I've seen the feedback." Sarah hesitated for a moment before continuing. "I know you wanted to get Dwayne riled up, but this is different. It's not just the interview that's getting attention. It's the way the conversation turned. People are talking about how you came off, how you tried to trap him. And honestly, it's starting to affect your brand." Brad finally met her gaze, his eyes narrowing. "You think I care about my brand right now? I was just doing my job." "Your job isn't just about getting views, Brad. Your job is about credibility," Sarah replied, her tone firm. "And right now, people are questioning yours." Brad leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "I never thought it would go like this. It was supposed to be a win for me. I thought I could expose him, make him look like a phony, and instead, I made myself look like an idiot." Sarah didn't say anything at first. She simply sat there, watching him, waiting for him to come to his own conclusion. He'd always been the one who controlled the narrative. But now, the tables had turned, and he was starting to realize just how much power Dwayne had. Brad's mind raced. Dwayne hadn't just outsmarted him. He'd shown him something. Something raw, something real. And now that Brad had seen it, he couldn't unsee it. The interview had become a microcosm of a larger conversation. Dwayne's message, his unflinching commitment to authenticity, was resonating beyond the confines of a television set. Across the country, people were starting to question the narratives they were fed daily. They were looking for something real, something that didn't come with an agenda or a scripted response. For Dwayne, the days after the interview were spent talking to those closest to him, friends, family, and colleagues who had been watching the fallout. They were proud of him for standing up, but they also knew the challenges that lay ahead. Being a voice for change was never easy, but it was necessary. He spent hours on the phone with his publicist, discussing how to navigate the aftermath. While the attention was largely positive, there were always those who would try to discredit him. They would label him as just another celebrity who didn't understand the nuances of politics or social issues. But Dwayne didn't care about that. He knew what he was doing. He wasn't here to please everyone. He was here to make a difference. It wasn't long before a call came in from one of the major news outlets, asking if Dwayne would be willing to participate in a live discussion about the state of media, authenticity, and the need for more honest conversations. He agreed almost immediately. It was time to take the message even further, to not just answer questions, but to ask them, to challenge the status quo, to show the world that people were capable of so much more than what they were being told. As Dwayne prepared for his upcoming interview, he knew it wasn't just about his words anymore. It was about the movement he was slowly becoming a part of. It was about turning the tide, about giving people the courage to be themselves and speak their truth, no matter what the world expected of them. He stared at his reflection in the mirror for a moment, thinking about the way everything had shifted since that fateful interview with Brad. He didn't know where this journey would take him, but he was ready. He had set something in motion, and there was no turning back. Back in his office, Brad was having his own quiet moment of reflection. He wasn't ready to embrace Dwayne's message fully, but he couldn't ignore it either. The world was changing, and the question was whether he would evolve with it, or remain stuck in the old ways. The choice was his. Dwayne stood backstage, waiting for his segment to start. The bright lights of the studio stage were visible through the curtains, but his focus wasn't on the cameras or the crew bustling about. His thoughts were elsewhere, on the bigger picture, on what he had set into motion after his explosive interview with Brad Turner. The invitation to this new show had come quickly, and it was a big one. The Roundtable Debate was a prestigious news show, airing at prime time on one of the largest networks. The format was simple, a panel of experts discussing current events with live audience interaction. But this time, Dwayne wasn't being invited as a guest for the usual promotion of his latest film or business venture. No, this time, he was going to speak about something much more profound, something that went beyond his usual domain of action films and box office hits. He had been asked directly to address the media's role in shaping public perception and the importance of authenticity in a world dominated by noise and headlines. It was a rare opportunity for Dwayne, and he knew it could be the defining moment of this new chapter in his life. As his name was called, he stepped out onto the stage with a smile, his usual charm intact, but there was something different in his stride. It wasn't arrogance or confidence that he wore, but a sense of purpose, of clarity. His eyes scanned the audience, the camera lights, the hosts seated at the round table. The host, Vanessa Wright, smiled warmly. "Dwayne Johnson, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We've all seen your recent interview with Brad Turner, and I have to say, it's been the topic of conversation across the country. How are you feeling after that moment?" Dwayne smiled, leaning forward slightly. "It's been an interesting week, Vanessa. To be honest, I'm still processing it all. But, in a way, I think that interview was a long time coming. We don't often get the chance to speak honestly, without agendas or preconceptions. And I think that's something the world needs more of." Vanessa nodded. "Your words really resonated with a lot of people. But, of course, not everyone agreed with you. Critics have said you're avoiding hard questions, that you're sidestepping the issues that need to be addressed. What do you say to that?" Dwayne's expression didn't waver. "I'll say this. The truth doesn't always fit neatly into a box. The real issue isn't whether or not I answered every question the way people wanted me to. The real issue is whether we can have an honest conversation in a world that seems to thrive on conflict and division. The question shouldn't be, what's your stance on this or that? It should be, can we have a discussion that actually moves us forward? The room was quiet for a moment. The audience seemed to hang on his every word. Dwayne continued, the media has a responsibility not just to entertain, but to inform, to challenge, to encourage dialogue. And too often, we focus on what will get the most clicks, the most views, instead of what will actually lead to understanding. Vanessa nodded slowly. It's an interesting point, Dwayne, but we also know the world isn't that simple. The media plays a huge role in shaping narratives. You can't just ignore that power. Absolutely, Dwayne replied. But that's exactly why we need to shift the narrative. The media is part of the problem, but it can also be part of the solution. It's not about avoiding tough topics, it's about how we approach them. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Brad Turner sat in his office, watching Dwayne's interview on a live feed. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, his head leaning against his palm as he watched Dwayne speak. He could feel the weight of Dwayne's words, the quiet force behind them. The way Dwayne wasn't just giving answers, he was asking questions. And those questions had begun to haunt Brad. The truth was, Brad had always prided himself on being a sharp interviewer, on controlling the narrative. But after his clash with Dwayne, he couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, he had been part of the problem. Dwayne had challenged not just his approach to the interview, but the entire framework of how media worked. It was easy to dismiss a guest message when you were in the driver's seat, but Brad had felt the power of being on the receiving end of that message. The criticism was relentless. The comments online, the whispering among his colleagues, the articles calling him out for his hostile approach. It was starting to eat at him. He couldn't escape the fact that his career, his identity, had become tied to a persona that he was now questioning. Was it too late to change? Was it even possible to redeem himself in the eyes of his audience? His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from his producer, Sarah. He answered quickly. Brad, I need to talk to you about something, she said, her tone sharp, but not unkind. Go ahead, Brad said, bracing himself. We've been getting a lot of feedback. The ratings are still solid, but there's a growing sense that people are tuning in less for your insight and more for the drama. We've been pushing the edge, and it's worked in terms of numbers. But I'm starting to think it's not sustainable. I've had people approach me, saying they're concerned about the way things are going. Brad sighed deeply, staring out the window. I know. I've been feeling it too. I've been thinking a lot about the interview with Dwayne. Maybe I've been doing it all wrong. Sarah was quiet for a beat. What do you mean? I mean, I've been so caught up in playing the part and being the guy who asks the tough questions that I forgot what it means to really ask the important ones. Dwayne was right. It's not just about getting sound bites or stirring controversy. It's about having a conversation, about moving things forward. Sarah paused before responding. So, what now? Brad stood up from his desk, pacing the room. I don't know. I guess it's time to rethink everything. I've been thinking about what Dwayne said. I'm not sure where this path leads, but maybe it's time to stop following the script. The evening ended with Dwayne leaving the studio, his mind buzzing with a mix of satisfaction and anticipation. He had spoken his truth, and he could already tell it was resonating with people. The feedback was overwhelmingly positive, with people applauding him for taking a stand. But in the back of his mind, he knew that this was just the beginning. His message of authenticity was gaining traction, but there were still battles to be fought. Battles with himself, with the media, and with the larger world that was slowly waking up to the power of honest conversation. Back in his hotel, he sat alone for a few moments, reflecting on how much had changed in such a short period of time. From the initial spark of that interview with Brad Turner to the broader conversation he was now leading, it was both exhilarating and humbling. He had never imagined that his platform could be used for something this meaningful, but now that it was happening, he couldn't turn back. And for the first time in a long while, Dwayne felt truly at peace with his purpose. Dwayne's face was plastered across the headlines, his message of authenticity reverberating far beyond the walls of the studio. Everywhere he went, there was a growing sense that he was more than just the action star, more than just The Rock. He was becoming a cultural icon of sorts, someone who wasn't afraid to speak out, to question the norms. But as much as he relished the response, he couldn't shake the feeling that this newfound platform came with expectations. Expectations he wasn't entirely sure he was prepared for. The pressure was mounting. Today, Dwayne was scheduled to meet with a prominent media network about a potential series that would further explore his journey, his philosophy, his commitment to authenticity, and how he planned to make a meaningful impact on the world. The meeting was a huge opportunity. It could be the next step in solidifying his place as more than just an entertainer. It was a chance to take his voice into a new, more powerful realm. But, as he sat in the waiting room of the network's building, Dwayne couldn't help but wonder, was he ready for what was next? He had challenged the status quo, but now it seemed like everyone wanted a piece of the message. How much of himself could he give before it started to feel like a performance? A soft chime interrupted his thoughts. His phone buzzed, and Dwayne glanced down. It was a text from his publicist. "Dwayne, just a heads up. We've been hearing rumblings of a response coming from Brad Turner's camp. Could be a counter-interview or some kind of statement. Stay tuned." Brad. The name alone sparked a quiet frustration in Dwayne. Since their infamous interview, Brad had been conspicuously silent in public. But Dwayne knew him too well. Brad wasn't the type to simply fade away. If he was gearing up for a response, it was likely to be calculated, something designed to regain his own control of the narrative. Brad was far from idle. In fact, he had been working nonstop since Dwayne's interview to salvage his image. What had started as an embarrassing defeat was slowly turning into a full-blown crisis. His team had advised him to lie low, to let the storm pass, but Brad wasn't the type to fade into obscurity. He was a fighter. Brad had already reached out to several media outlets, all promising to give him the platform he needed to set the record straight. He was going to turn the tables again, but this time, he wasn't going to go for the typical confrontation. No, this time he had something more strategic in mind. In his office, he paced back and forth, rehearsing what he was going to say. He had watched Dwayne's recent interviews, taking mental notes on how Dwayne had sidestepped difficult questions with a quiet confidence. It was clear to Brad that Dwayne wasn't just responding to questions. He was steering the conversation entirely. "I need to do the same," Brad muttered to himself. He picked up the phone and dialed his manager. "Sarah, we're setting up a counter-interview," Brad said, his voice sharp. "I'm not going to sit back and let this narrative play out without fighting back." Sarah hesitated before responding. "Brad, are you sure this is the right move? It's been a week. The buzz is already fading. If you go at Dwayne now, it might just look desperate." Brad was quiet for a moment. "Maybe, but I can't just let him control the narrative. I'll set the tone this time. I'll ask the hard questions. No one gets away with making me look foolish." As the day of the meeting with the media network approached, Dwayne couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the brink of something much bigger. He had known that the fight for authenticity would make waves, but now it felt as though he was entering uncharted waters. With Brad's counter-interview looming and the attention his own words had garnered, Dwayne had to decide. Would he continue pushing the boundaries of his new role in the media, or would he back off and let the storm pass? His phone buzzed again, this time with a message from his agent. "Dwayne, we've received a formal invitation from Brad Turner's team. They're calling it The Truth Behind the Interview, a conversation with Brad Turner. He's looking to air it live, and he's requesting you as a guest." Dwayne read the message, his heart racing slightly. This was the moment he had been expecting. The battle for control of the narrative was about to be waged on live television. But how would he play it? He knew this wasn't just about defending himself or his views. It was about something much more profound, about showing the world that people could come together even after a conflict and have a real conversation. This was the test. He could either meet Brad's challenge head-on with more of the same, a back and forth of quick-witted punches, or he could approach it differently. He could take the high road and try to de-escalate. Dwayne knew that if he chose the latter, it would take a level of patience he hadn't yet mastered. But deep down, he knew he wasn't here to fight for the title of victim. He wasn't here to perpetuate the division. If he was going to stand for authenticity, it had to be in every aspect of this conversation, even when it was uncomfortable. The meeting with the media network went as expected, professional, forward-thinking, and full of promises about potential collaborations. But Dwayne couldn't fully focus. His mind was on the invitation to Brad's show. As the meeting wrapped up, he turned to his publicist and agent, who were waiting outside. "What do we think about Brad's counter-interview?" he asked. They both exchanged a quick glance. His agent spoke first. "It could be a great opportunity. If you take the high road and steer the conversation back to what matters, authenticity, unity, it could work in your favor. But, Dwayne, this could also escalate things further. It could get messy." Dwayne's eyes narrowed slightly as he thought it over. "I'm not here to fight for the drama, but if Brad wants to keep going with the public confrontation, I'm not going to run away from it. I'll be there." The decision was made. Dwayne was going to face Brad head-on, not to win, but to make a statement. He wasn't just going to sit back and let the world continue to be shaped by noise and division. He was going to challenge it with his presence, his authenticity. Back in Brad's office, as he prepared for the counter-interview, he felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it, the moment that would define everything. If he could successfully turn the tables on Dwayne, he would be back on top. He would regain the control he had lost. But there was a quiet voice inside him, one that whispered doubts he hadn't wanted to acknowledge. Was this really the fight he wanted to continue? Or was he playing into a game that was already over? As the day of the interview drew closer, both men stood on the precipice of something bigger than either of them had anticipated. And the world was watching. The set was alive with energy, the cameras poised and ready to roll. Brad Turner stood off to the side, his suit sharp, his expression set in stone. This was his moment. He'd been planning this counter-interview for days, even weeks. He had studied Dwayne's past interviews, analyzing every word, every reaction. He knew Dwayne's strengths and weaknesses. This time, Brad was going to control the narrative. The crew buzzed around him, adjusting lights, checking microphones. The stage was set for a moment that would likely be talked about for months to come. The truth behind the interview was the title of tonight's show, and Brad was determined to get to the heart of what had transpired between him and Dwayne Johnson. Meanwhile, backstage, Dwayne paced, his mind focused, his heart steady. This was no longer about proving anything. It was about staying true to what he had started, the message he had been delivering all along. Authenticity, honesty, and the courage to be real in a world that thrived on conflict and division. He knew this wasn't going to be a typical interview. Brad was no fool. He would come for Dwayne's every word, looking for any vulnerability he could exploit. But Dwayne wasn't worried. He had faced much tougher situations in his life. What was a live interview compared to the challenges he'd overcome? Nothing, really. As Dwayne was ushered onto the set, he couldn't help but glance around. The studio was huge, the audience full, the cameras glaring down on him. But in that moment, it felt almost peaceful. He had a deep knowing that this conversation, no matter how intense, would be the kind of dialogue that could spark change. This was bigger than the ratings, bigger than the headlines. It was about shifting the conversation. The host, Vanessa Wright, introduced both men to the audience with an air of anticipation. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "tonight we have two powerful figures in the entertainment world, each with a very different perspective on the media, authenticity, and what it means to be heard. Brad Turner, a renowned journalist and TV personality, and Dwayne Johnson, a global icon who has been reshaping how we view celebrities and media. Welcome, gentlemen." Brad gave a stiff nod, his smile tight. Dwayne, on the other hand, offered a warm smile, his posture relaxed. "Thanks for having me, Vanessa," Dwayne said, his voice steady, warm, and inviting. Vanessa smiled, trying to set the tone for the evening. "It's great to have you both here. Now, let's get straight to it. Brad, your interview with Dwayne last week took the world by storm. But it also raised a lot of questions, especially regarding Dwayne's position on the role of the media in shaping public perception. Many people felt that Dwayne avoided some of the harder questions. What's your response to that?" Brad didn't hesitate. "Well, Vanessa, with all due respect, I believe that Dwayne's responses were calculated. He wasn't interested in answering the questions. He deflected, he danced around issues, and when it got tough, he turned the conversation into a lecture about the media. The fact is, he wasn't interested in having a real conversation. He was more concerned with protecting his image. Dwayne's eyes narrowed slightly, but he stayed calm, steady. With all due respect, Brad, I think you're missing the point. The issue isn't about me dodging tough questions. It's about how those questions were framed. You weren't interested in having a dialogue. You were interested in creating a spectacle, and I'm not here for that. The tension was palpable. Brad's lips tightened into a thin line, his eyes flashing for a moment. He was quick to respond. A spectacle? Dwayne, with all your talk about authenticity, what I saw that night was a man more concerned with his image than with engaging in meaningful discourse. You deflected. You spun everything to fit your narrative. I don't think that's true, Brad, Dwayne replied, his voice calm but firm. I think you're more interested in fighting for the spotlight than actually digging into the conversation. My image isn't something I need to defend. It's my integrity I'm focused on, and I'm not going to sit here and let you twist my words to fit your agenda. The audience could feel the electricity in the air. The conversation had taken a dramatic turn, and it was clear that neither man was going to back down. Brad, now visibly irritated, leaned forward, his voice rising slightly. Integrity, Dwayne? Or is it just a convenient excuse for not taking responsibility for your words? You sit here and preach about authenticity, but when asked the tough questions, you act like the media is somehow the enemy. It's an easy out, don't you think? The truth is, you control the narrative because you have the power to do so. But for the rest of us, we don't have that luxury. We have to fight for our voices. Dwayne's response was measured, but the conviction in his tone was unmistakable. Brad, you're right in one sense. We all have to fight for our voices. But the problem is that the media has created a world where only certain voices are heard. We live in an age where headlines are more important than truth, where soundbites replace substance. That's the real fight. It's not about protecting my image. It's about ensuring that everyone has the freedom to speak their truth without being judged or misrepresented. The audience was silent now, hanging on every word. Dwayne's words were powerful, resonating with more than just the crowd in the studio. They were landing with millions watching at home. Brad shifted in his seat, his jaw clenched. You keep saying that, Dwayne, Brad said, his voice calm now, but with a sharp edge. But you're forgetting one thing. The media is a mirror of society. We reflect what people want to see. And if you think for a second that your version of truth is the only one that matters, then I have to question your understanding of reality. Dwayne took a deep breath, holding his ground. Brad, I'm not saying my version is the only truth. What I'm saying is that truth isn't just one thing. We can all share our perspectives without tearing each other down. And that's the point I've been trying to make from the start. We need to have a conversation that includes all voices, not just the ones that fit neatly into a headline. The tension between Dwayne and Brad was reaching a breaking point. The audience could feel the weight of the moment. It wasn't just about the battle of words. It was about something much larger. The debate about authenticity, the role of the media, and the power of truth were all on display in real time for the world to see. Brad could sense that the conversation was slipping from his grasp. Dwayne was speaking from a place of conviction, and it was clear that his message was resonating with the audience. Brad's usual tactic of attacking the guest was backfiring. There was a moment of silence as Brad gathered his thoughts, then he looked directly at Dwayne. I don't agree with you, Dwayne, but I respect your right to say what you believe. Maybe that's where we differ. I'll keep fighting for my truth, and you'll keep fighting for yours. Dwayne's eyes softened slightly. And that's the beauty of it, Brad. We're both allowed to have our truths. We just need to respect each other enough to listen. The host, Vanessa Wright, stepped in to guide the conversation back. Well, gentlemen, it seems like we've reached an impasse. But what we can take away from tonight is that this conversation isn't going to end here. It's only just begun. Thank you both for being here tonight. As the cameras cut to black and the show went to commercial, the energy in the studio was palpable. Dwayne sat back in his chair, a small smile on his face. He knew this interview had been about more than just him and Brad. It had been about shifting the conversation, starting something bigger than the two of them. As he walked off the set, he felt a quiet satisfaction. No matter what happened next, he had done what he came to do. He had stood by his beliefs, unapologetically and authentically. Brad, on the other hand, wasn't as sure. He sat in the green room, staring at his reflection in the mirror. He had tried to dominate the conversation, but he couldn't help feeling that Dwayne had somehow won. He wasn't sure what it meant yet, but something had shifted inside him, and it would take time to understand just what that shift was. In the days following the explosive interview, the media storm grew into a full-blown whirlwind. Social media exploded with opinions, memes, and think pieces. Headlines ranged from Dwayne Johnson shuts down Brad Turner in epic showdown to Brad Turner versus Dwayne Johnson. Who won the battle of words? The conversation was far from over. It was just beginning. For Dwayne, the aftermath felt surreal. He had been through some tough interviews in his career, but nothing quite like this. The media's attention was intense, but it wasn't all negative. His supporters rallied behind him, praising his composure and his commitment to honesty and integrity. Tweets, Instagram posts, and TikTok videos flooded in, with people quoting his lines about truth, authenticity, and the need for all voices to be heard. But of course, not everyone was on his side. In the hours following the interview, news outlets aired segments dissecting the conversation. Brad's supporters argued that Dwayne had been evasive, that he had avoided addressing the real issues with his usual charm and charisma. To them, Dwayne was just another celebrity trying to avoid the hard truths and manipulate the narrative in his favor. He's hiding behind his brand, some critics said. Still, Dwayne wasn't bothered. He had expected this kind of reaction. It was part of the game. What mattered was that the message had gotten through to the people who needed to hear it. For Brad, the aftermath was much more difficult to navigate. The online response was less than kind. His interview was dissected, analyzed, and criticized from all angles. Many people accused him of being too combative, too eager to tear Dwayne down rather than engage in a productive conversation. The hashtag Brad Turner fail began trending, with countless people mocking his approach. Brad couldn't escape it. Every time he opened his phone, another tweet or Instagram post slammed him for his performance. It was a harsh reminder of the power of social media in shaping public perception. In his office at the network, Brad sat in silence, scrolling through the feedback. His phone buzzed with notifications, each one more critical than the last. His usual confidence was shaken. This wasn't just about a bad interview. It felt like his entire career was on the line. He tried to rationalize it, to explain to himself that the backlash was simply part of the job. Journalists got hate all the time. But this felt different. It felt personal. The intensity of the public reaction unsettled him in a way he hadn't expected. "Brad, we need to talk," his boss, Gregory, said as he walked into Brad's office, snapping him out of his thoughts. Gregory was the kind of person who lived for the ratings. When he walked into a room, it was like the air changed. He had a way of making you feel like your career was hanging by a thread. But right now, Gregory didn't look angry. He looked concerned. "This interview," Gregory continued, "it's been everywhere. The numbers are through the roof, but the feedback, it's been brutal. People are questioning your approach." Brad leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "I don't care about the feedback. I did my job." Dwayne avoided the tough questions, and I called him out for it. Gregory gave him a knowing look. "It's not about your job, Brad. It's about the brand we've built. And right now, it's not looking great. We need to think about the next steps." Brad felt a knot form in his stomach. He knew Gregory was right, but admitting it out loud felt like failure. He had built his career on being sharp, on getting the truth no matter what. But now, it felt like he had lost his way. Dwayne, on the other hand, was handling the aftermath with his trademark coolness. His social media was filled with support, and he was more than happy to engage with fans who sent positive messages. He spent hours replying to comments, sharing personal stories, and encouraging people to keep speaking their truth. One message stood out more than the others. It was from a young woman named Jessica who had struggled with body image issues her whole life. She wrote about how Dwayne's words about authenticity had made her feel empowered for the first time in years. "You don't even know how much you've helped me," Jessica wrote. "Thank you for being real." That message brought a smile to Dwayne's face. This was why he did what he did. This was why he went on the interview in the first place. Not for the ratings, not for the headlines, but for moments like this. For people who needed to hear that they were enough, that they didn't have to fit into some mold that society tried to force on them. But even as Dwayne basked in the positive response, he knew the fight was far from over. The media might have painted him as the hero in the battle with Brad, but there was still more work to do. There was still a bigger conversation to be had. Brad's crisis reached its peak when a viral video began circulating. It was a behind-the-scenes clip from the interview that had been taken by one of the crew members. In it, Brad was seen arguing with a producer about the direction of the conversation before the show aired. The argument, which had been about how to handle Dwayne's responses, painted Brad in an even worse light. The video didn't do him any favors. Now, it seemed that his personal motives were under scrutiny, not just his journalistic integrity. The clip showed him pushing for more confrontational questions, demanding that Dwayne squirm on air. The backlash was swift. It wasn't just his interview style anymore. It was his professionalism that was being called into question. Brad knew that this was a turning point. He could feel the walls closing in. Meanwhile, Dwayne's popularity soared. People praised his composed, respectful demeanor. His approach was seen as a refreshing contrast to Brad's aggressive tactics. Celebrities, influencers, and even other journalists began sharing their support for Dwayne, praising him for standing firm and speaking truth to power. As the days passed, Brad found himself at a crossroads. His career, once a guaranteed success, was now in jeopardy. He needed to figure out his next move, and fast. The media could be fickle, but the public's reaction had made it clear. He had miscalculated. On the other hand, Dwayne felt a sense of fulfillment that he hadn't expected. The response to his message of authenticity was overwhelming. People were reaching out to thank him, to share their stories of how his words had impacted them. It was the kind of influence he had always wanted to have. Not just as a celebrity, but as someone who could inspire real change. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The media circus that followed Dwayne's legendary takedown of Brad Turner only intensified. It was a firestorm that seemed unstoppable, consuming everything in its path. Dwayne was invited to dozens of talk shows and podcasts to discuss his experience, his thoughts on free speech, and what he believed the role of a public figure was in today's world. His words resonated deeply with people from all walks of life, creating a movement that grew faster than he had ever imagined. Dwayne Johnson isn't just a movie star. He's a voice of reason in a world that seems to be losing its way, a columnist wrote, and that's why people love him. For Dwayne, the entire experience was surreal. He had gone from being a larger-than-life action star to being the embodiment of something much more significant, someone who stood up for honesty, authenticity, and respect in an age where those values seemed to be under constant attack. He didn't expect to be the face of such a movement, but as the days wore on, he embraced it. The messages from fans kept pouring in, and his schedule became packed with interviews and events centered around his newfound platform. But amidst the success, there was something Dwayne couldn't shake. The nagging feeling that it was all part of the bigger machine. The media was quick to elevate him, quick to label him a hero, but how much of it was real, and how much of it was a carefully crafted narrative? The questions echoed in his mind, but he pushed them aside for now. He had a mission, and for the time being, that was enough. Brad, on the other hand, was struggling to navigate the aftermath. The viral video had all but sealed his fate. What had started as a momentary bump in his career had turned into a full-blown crisis. His name was trending on social media for all the wrong reasons, and the criticism was only growing louder. It wasn't just about the failed interview anymore. It was about his credibility as a journalist. In the days following the video's release, his network had called him in for a meeting. It was an uncomfortable one. "We're getting a lot of heat, Brad," Gregory said, leaning forward across the table. His face was stern. "People are questioning your professionalism. There are those who think you were too aggressive, that you crossed a line." Brad sat back, trying to mask his frustration. He had been doing his job. He had pushed for the truth, hadn't he? He was only doing what any journalist worth their salt would have done. But now, it seemed like the game had changed. The lines weren't as clear-cut as they once had been, and what he'd thought was a bold approach now felt like a misstep. "I did what I thought was right," Brad said, his voice low but steady. "I wasn't going to let Dwayne get away with his usual charm and dodge the tough questions." Gregory sighed, rubbing his temple. "Look, I get it. But right now, we're in damage control mode. You need to lay low for a while. People are starting to lose faith in you." Brad's stomach twisted. Lay low? That wasn't who he was. He had always been the one in control, the one making the headlines. But now, his reputation was on the line, and he wasn't sure how to get it back. Just when Dwayne thought his life had settled into a new rhythm, something unexpected happened. He received a call that would change everything. It was from a major network. They wanted him to host a new series, a documentary-style show about the importance of speaking out, telling the truth, and having difficult conversations in the public eye. The offer was unlike anything he had been approached with before. This wasn't a blockbuster movie role. This wasn't a celebrity endorsement. It was a chance to do something real, something that aligned with the message he had been championing since the interview. The timing couldn't have been better. The media was still buzzing from his confrontation with Brad, and now here was an opportunity to further solidify himself as a thought leader in a space that had always been dominated by politicians and pundits. The show would give him a platform to speak to some of the most influential voices in America, voices that were ready to dive deep into issues that really mattered. It was tempting. It was an opportunity that most people would dream of. But Dwayne wasn't sure if he was ready to step into this role just yet. Hosting a show like this meant being in the spotlight constantly. It meant answering tough questions, facing critics, and engaging in some of the most challenging conversations he could imagine. It meant becoming a central figure in an ongoing debate that had only just begun. "Do I really want to do this?" Dwayne muttered to himself as he sat in his hotel room, looking out at the sprawling cityscape below. The weight of the decision was heavy on his shoulders, but he couldn't ignore the pull. This was bigger than movies. This was bigger than entertainment. This was his chance to make a real impact. Meanwhile, Brad faced a different kind of dilemma. After days of hiding from the fallout, he had been offered an exclusive sit-down with another major news network. It was a chance to redeem himself, to explain his side of the story, and to shift the narrative back in his favor. But the opportunity came with a catch. He would need to publicly apologize for the way he had handled the interview with Dwayne. Brad sat at his desk, staring at the email from the producer. The words seemed to burn on the screen. Apologize. He had spent his entire career fighting for the truth, for the hard-hitting stories. He had built his identity on being unapologetically bold. But now, here he was, being asked to apologize for doing what he believed was right. His mind raced. Would an apology be enough? Would it truly salvage his career? Or would it be seen as an act of weakness? The pressure was mounting, and he couldn't decide which path would offer him redemption, if any. Dwayne and Brad stood at similar crossroads, each facing a pivotal moment in their careers. Dwayne had the chance to step into a new world of influence, one that required him to balance his celebrity with the weight of responsibility. Brad, on the other hand, had to decide whether to humble himself and apologize, or whether to double down on his approach and risk losing everything. Both men had been caught up in a media storm, each dealing with the consequences in their own way. But the decisions they made in the coming days would set the course for the rest of their careers. Would Dwayne embrace his new platform and continue his journey of authenticity? Or would Brad find a way to recover from his fall from grace? Only time would tell. The weight of the decisions they faced was becoming unbearable. Every move, every word, every action felt like it would tip the scales between success and failure. Dwayne and Brad were caught in a tug-of-war, each pulling in different directions, and neither man knew exactly which way the universe would decide to take them. Dwayne knew the opportunity to host a series was a once-in-a-lifetime chance. But it wasn't just about his career. It was about something deeper, something he hadn't fully articulated to himself until now. As a public figure, he had always used his platform to inspire, but this show had the potential to amplify his message in ways he couldn't have predicted. For days, he tossed and turned, wondering whether he was ready for such a commitment. The show wasn't just about celebrity gossip or entertainment. It was about serious conversations with real-world impact. The topics covered would require him to delve into uncomfortable territory address political divides, and face tough, emotional conversations head-on. He would no longer be just The Rock. He'd be a leader, a guide, someone people look to for answers. Dwayne's agent called him the next day to push for a decision. "We've got a tight timeline, Dwayne. The network wants a commitment. This show is a big deal, and we don't want anyone else to scoop it up." He sat in silence for a moment, then replied, "I'm in." The decision, though filled with excitement, left him with a gnawing feeling deep inside. Was he ready to be that voice? Could he walk the fine line between personal brand and societal responsibility? There was no turning back now. As Dwayne prepared for the first meeting with the network, he had a heart-to-heart with his longtime friend and manager, Terry. Terry was the one person who had seen Dwayne through all his ups and downs. He knew what the decision meant, and he didn't sugarcoat things. "Dwayne, this isn't just about being a celebrity anymore. It's about using your platform for real change. You're going to face pushback. People are going to question your motives, your authenticity. You've already seen how quickly things can turn. Are you ready for all of it?" Dwayne took a deep breath. "I've been through some tough things, Terry. This feels different, but I know it's the right step. I'm ready." Meanwhile, Brad's life was unraveling at an alarming rate. The constant barrage of criticism was relentless. Every day, he found himself checking his mentions, seeing more and more people condemning his behavior. The situation wasn't improving. Worse, the network had pulled him off air, sidelining him indefinitely as they evaluated his future. He couldn't shake the feeling of humiliation. What had started as a simple interview, a chance to do his job, had spiraled out of control. Every failed attempt to defend his actions only seemed to make matters worse. He couldn't hide anymore. Gregory, his boss, had delivered an ultimatum. "We're pulling you off the air, Brad. The apology is non-negotiable. You need to mend things publicly or we're done. This network can't be associated with a journalist who isn't willing to admit when they've crossed a line." Brad's pride flared up. He didn't want to apologize. To him, it felt like admitting weakness, like handing over his dignity. But deep down, he knew Gregory was right. His career was on the line. After long hours of contemplation, Brad composed the apology. It wasn't easy. His words felt hollow at first, but as he wrote, he realized this wasn't just about salvaging his job. It was about recognizing the mistakes he'd made in the pursuit of fame. He couldn't undo what had happened, but he could at least show people that he was capable of growth. When Brad posted his apology on social media, the response was mixed. Some people applauded him for being humble, for admitting his faults. Others saw it as too little, too late. They had already made up their minds about him. Some thought it was just another attempt to save his career, while others saw sincerity in his words. It wasn't the universal approval Brad had hoped for, but it was a start. The apology was only the first step in rebuilding his image, if he even had a chance at that. He had learned a valuable lesson through this process, one that would shape his future actions. Dwayne, in contrast, was met with overwhelming support. His decision to take on the show was met with cheers from his fans, who praised him for using his platform for something greater than fame or fortune. He was now a beacon of truth, an advocate for change, and an example of what it meant to stand up for one's beliefs. People were watching him closely, expecting him to deliver on the promises he made in his past interviews. But as much as Dwayne basked in the glow of success, he couldn't forget the looming challenges. The backlash wasn't over. People would continue to question his motives, his approach, and his authenticity. This was only the beginning. The media continued to spin their narratives, pitting Dwayne's authenticity against Brad's regret. But the truth was far more complicated. While Dwayne had found his calling, Brad had been forced to confront his own flaws. Both men were navigating treacherous waters, trying to come to terms with the public's perception of them. As Dwayne prepared for the premiere of his new show, he knew it wouldn't be easy. He wasn't just stepping into a new role. He was stepping into a new phase of his life, one that required him to speak his truth every single day. There was no room for error. People expected more from him now. He had to be careful not to let his celebrity overshadow the message he wanted to convey. Brad, on the other hand, had to take a long, hard look at his career and decide what kind of journalist he wanted to be. The audience had seen his vulnerabilities, and some had respected him for it. But others were unforgiving, believing that once trust had been broken, it was impossible to repair. Brad's future was uncertain, but there was still hope for redemption. It would take time and a lot of hard work, but perhaps he could find a way back into the good graces of his audience. The paths of Dwayne and Brad were now diverging. Dwayne had embraced a new mission that aligned with his values, ready to challenge the status quo and use his platform to engage with important issues. Brad, on the other hand, had to rebuild his credibility, facing the consequences of his actions while grappling with a shifting career. The future for both men was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Their stories were far from over. The world would be watching as they each navigated the personal and professional challenges that awaited them. Dwayne Johnson stood before the cameras for the first time as the host of his new documentary series. The set was sleek, modern, and had a sense of quiet authority to it. The lighting cast soft shadows across his face, and the crew bustled around, preparing for what was about to unfold. This was the moment he had been working toward since the fateful interview with Brad Turner. But even though the set looked polished, Dwayne felt the weight of the task ahead of him. This was more than just a job. It was a responsibility. He was no longer the action hero. He was now a voice for change, and the world was waiting for him to deliver. The episode was set to focus on the importance of free speech, but it wasn't just a political discussion. It was about the complexities of standing up for what you believe in, especially in a world where everyone seemed to be at odds. Dwayne was nervous, but he had prepared. He had spent countless hours reading, researching, and rehearsing. But nothing could fully prepare him for the conversation that would unfold on live television. His first guest was a prominent political commentator, known for her controversial views. She had been outspoken about the dangers of political correctness and the need for open discourse. The conversation began smoothly, but Dwayne quickly found himself at a crossroads. The guest made several statements that pushed the boundaries of what many considered acceptable, but Dwayne wasn't just going to let them slide. "Do you truly believe that," Dwayne asked, his voice calm but firm, "that what you're saying is helping foster meaningful conversation? Or is it just adding fuel to the fire?" The guest, initially surprised by his directness, stammered before attempting to clarify her position. Dwayne wasn't buying it. He had learned the importance of holding people accountable, even when they were sitting across from him. The tension in the room thickened. But Dwayne's ability to stay calm, to challenge while respecting the other person's viewpoint, won the moment. The audience was hooked. The episode didn't just discuss free speech. It became a masterclass in navigating difficult conversations. As the cameras stopped rolling, Dwayne sat back in his chair, exhaling deeply. The challenge had been intense, but he felt the power of what he had just done. This was his new path. He was shaping the narrative, not just reacting to it. He wasn't here to be liked by everyone, but he was here to be authentic. While Dwayne was finding his footing as a host, Brad Turner was back at the drawing board. His public apology had done little to change the tide of his situation. His reputation was in tatters, and his once promising career in journalism seemed like a distant memory. The network had kept him on the sidelines, and it seemed like his path forward was as unclear as ever. But Brad wasn't one to back down. He couldn't afford to. He had worked too hard to get where he was to let it slip away. And so, in a moment of desperation, he made a bold decision. He would turn the tables. Brad reached out to Dwayne. It wasn't a call he wanted to make, but it was the only option left. He knew that Dwayne had become a symbol of authenticity, someone who had faced down adversity and emerged victorious. Brad needed to interview Dwayne, to not just rebuild his own image, but to get inside the mind of the man who had captivated the world. The idea was risky. He didn't know how Dwayne would respond, but Brad had reached a point where he didn't have much to lose. Brad's heart raced as he dialed Dwayne's number. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. And then Dwayne picked up. "Brad, what's up?" Dwayne's voice was casual, almost as if nothing had happened between them. "Hey, Dwayne. It's Brad. I know we've had our differences, but I think it's time for us to talk. On camera. I want to interview you. I need your help, man." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Dwayne wasn't sure where this conversation was going. Brad had done some damage with their last encounter, and Dwayne wasn't sure if he was ready to be the redemption story Brad was hoping for. "Why me?" Dwayne finally asked. You've got a ton of other people you can interview. Brad hesitated. Because you're the one who gets it. You're the one who faced the storm and came out stronger. And I need to hear that story. I need to understand what makes you tick. Maybe I can learn something along the way. And maybe, just maybe, it could help me find my way back. Dwayne thought about it. He knew that Brad was in a tough spot. The man had made mistakes, but he wasn't beyond redemption. Still, this was an unexpected request. Okay, Dwayne said after a beat. But we're doing it on my terms. No gotcha moments, no fake apologies. We sit down, we talk, and we keep it real. You good with that? Brad nodded, relieved that Dwayne hadn't immediately shut him down. Absolutely. I'm ready. When the day of the interview arrived, the tension between them was palpable. Dwayne sat across from Brad, who had prepared meticulously for the conversation. The cameras were rolling, but this wasn't about spectacle. This was about honesty, and both men understood that. Brad opened the conversation, acknowledging the tension in the room. Dwayne, we've had our differences, but I want to get right into it. What made you decide to go public with your beliefs? To step out and challenge the narrative? Dwayne smiled, a sense of calm confidence radiating from him. I've always been about being real, Brad. I think people are tired of the nonsense. They want authenticity, not a show. And I realized, if I'm going to keep my platform, I'd better use it for something that matters. Brad listened intently, nodding as Dwayne spoke. The words seemed to resonate with him. This wasn't just a celebrity giving a performance. It was a man who had weathered the storm and come out the other side with a clearer sense of purpose. But Brad wasn't done yet. He needed to dig deeper. You said it's not just about a show, Dwayne, but is it ever easy to walk that path? I mean, don't you ever get tempted to play along with the expectations, to just keep the peace? Dwayne paused. Of course it's tempting, but then I think about all the people who can't speak their truth. The people who are too scared to stand up for what they believe in. That's why I do it. Not for me, but for them. The interview between Dwayne and Brad was unlike any other. It wasn't just about the interview. It was about both men, in that moment, coming to terms with their personal journeys. Dwayne had proven that staying true to oneself was the key to lasting success. And Brad, through his vulnerability and willingness to listen, had begun his path to redemption. The episode aired to a rapt audience, and the response was overwhelming. People saw the sincerity in Brad's apology, and they admired Dwayne's ability to rise above the drama. It was clear that both men had learned important lessons, not just about their careers, but about themselves. Dwayne's newfound platform had been met with praise, but now, for the first time, he was starting to feel the heat of being a public figure who spoke his truth. The fallout from his show's first episode wasn't what he had expected. Instead of the overwhelming support he had grown accustomed to, there were voices in the crowd that began to question his authenticity. Some saw his boldness as nothing more than a performance. Others felt his message was too heavy-handed. Dwayne, it's not too late to walk it back, his PR manager suggested during an emergency meeting. The backlash is growing, and we don't want to alienate any part of your fan base. Dwayne's face hardened. I'm not walking anything back. This is who I am. If people don't like it, fine. But I'm not going to compromise myself to please anyone. The pressure was mounting, though, and he couldn't deny that there were moments when he felt the weight of being in the public eye like never before. Being real came with its own consequences. People wanted him to entertain them, not challenge them. Some of his fans felt like they had been misled, that they hadn't signed up for a Dwayne who delved into political discussions and social issues. They wanted action-packed movies, not real-world debates. Still, Dwayne wasn't backing down. He couldn't. His sense of responsibility had been too strongly ignited. He had a platform, and he wasn't going to waste it. Brad, meanwhile, had hoped that the interview with Dwayne would be the first step in his redemption arc. But instead, it became the catalyst for something much bigger and much more complicated. As the interview aired, Brad received a flood of messages, not all of them positive. While the interview had sparked some genuine reflection and sympathy, it also attracted criticism from those who saw it as an attempt at damage control. To them, Brad wasn't a journalist anymore. He was a man desperate for a second chance, and no amount of apology could erase the damage he had caused. Worse still, Brad found that some of his old colleagues were openly mocking him. A former colleague from a rival network took to social media to express their disdain. Brad Turner is playing the victim card, but the truth is, he made his bet. Now he has to lie in it. We've all seen how far he'll go to stay relevant. Brad was crushed. He had thought that coming clean would restore his dignity, but instead, it seemed to have only made things worse. The public wanted drama, not humility. They wanted to see him fall harder, not rise up. The pressure was almost unbearable. Brad couldn't sleep. He spent days watching the comments, analyzing the way the public had turned against him. He needed guidance, something to show him how to move forward. That's when he received an unexpected call. It was from Dwayne. "Brad, we need to talk." Dwayne's voice boomed over the phone. There was no preamble, no small talk. "I'm seeing what's happening, and I know it's tough right now. But you can't give up." Brad swallowed. He hadn't expected Dwayne to reach out like this, especially after everything that had happened between them. "I don't know what to do, Dwayne. It's like I can't do anything right anymore. Every move I make just digs the hole deeper." Dwayne paused, then spoke, his tone measured. "Listen, I've been where you are, Brad. You've got two choices. You can either keep trying to please everyone, or you can stay true to yourself. If you keep bending to what people want from you, it'll never end. But if you own your mistakes, if you show people you're learning and evolving, that's where the power is." Brad's mind raced. Dwayne's words felt like a wake-up call. "But how do I do that? How do I show people that I've changed?" "You start by being vulnerable, Brad. Be real. Share your journey. Not the apology, but the actual journey. The struggle, the lessons learned, the growth. People respect authenticity. They might not forgive you overnight, but they'll respect you more than if you keep pretending you've got it all figured out." Brad felt a shift inside him. Maybe Dwayne was right. Maybe it was time to stop trying to force a comeback and instead focus on the truth of his own transformation. "Thanks, Dwayne," Brad said, his voice quieter now. "I think I get it. I need to stop pretending to be someone I'm not. I'll take it from here." While Brad wrestled with his redemption, Dwayne found himself facing an even greater challenge. The second episode of his show was coming up, and the network had made it clear that they wanted more dramatic content. The show had done well so far, but they needed ratings to spike. "We want you to dive deeper into the controversy, Dwayne," the network executive said over the phone. "We need something that will get people talking. Maybe bring in someone you can really clash with, someone who's not afraid to challenge you." Dwayne was uneasy. This wasn't why he signed on for the show. He had chosen this path to facilitate real conversations, not to create conflict for the sake of ratings. Still, he couldn't ignore the pressure. "I don't think that's what this show is about," Dwayne replied, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not here to start fights. I'm here to have important discussions." The executive seemed to understand, but there was no mistaking the underlying expectation. "Just consider it, Dwayne. We know you've got the charisma to make it work. We want to keep this show at the top of the charts." Dwayne sat back in his chair, feeling torn. The easy path was right in front of him, but it wasn't the path he had set out to follow. His thoughts turned to Brad and the struggles they both faced. The world didn't want them to be their authentic selves. It wanted drama. But Dwayne wasn't willing to compromise. Both men, in their separate worlds, were grappling with pressure and expectations. Dwayne was at a crossroads, realizing that the media landscape wasn't always about truth. It was often about what's sold. And Brad, despite his desire for redemption, was learning just how unforgiving the public could be. But there was one thing they both shared: the realization that this was no longer just about their careers. It was about something bigger, their own integrity. The choices they made from here on out would define not just their future in the public eye, but their very sense of self. Dwayne had always been a man who trusted his instincts. It was something he had learned over the years, whether on the set of action movies or in his personal life. But now, as he faced the escalating pressure of his new role, those instincts were being tested like never before. It had been a week since his conversation with the network executive, and the weight of the decision was starting to settle in. He could feel the pull of the easy path, the path where he gave the audience what they wanted: drama, conflict, and sensationalism. But deep down, Dwayne knew that wasn't why he'd stepped into this role. He hadn't agreed to host this show just to play to the lowest common denominator. But the network's pressure was relentless. Ratings were starting to dip, and there was a clear sense that if Dwayne didn't give in to their demands, the show would be canceled. "We want more, Dwayne," the executive had said again during a tense meeting. "You can't just rely on your charm. We need content that goes viral. Controversy sells. If you want to stay relevant, you need to bring it." And so, Dwayne faced a choice. Should he continue to resist and risk losing everything he had worked for? Or should he compromise his values and deliver what the network demanded? He needed a sign, something that would make the decision easier. Meanwhile, Brad was trying to figure out his own next move. His apology tour hadn't worked. In fact, it had backfired. People still saw him as the man who had sold out, the one who had been caught in a scandal and tried to crawl his way back. But Brad wasn't ready to give up. He had learned something important during his conversation with Dwayne. It wasn't about the mistakes you made, but how you grew from them. Brad had spent the past few days reconnecting with old colleagues, asking for honest feedback about how he could rebuild his credibility. The response wasn't warm. Most people didn't want to give him the time of day. But one conversation stuck with him, a former producer who had worked with him years ago. "Brad, it's not about fighting for your place back in the industry. It's about redefining what you stand for," the producer had said. "If you're going to come back, do it on your terms. Don't let anyone dictate your narrative. Find something real, something people can connect with." That advice had stayed with Brad. He began thinking about how he could change the conversation, how he could be a force for good instead of the man everyone wanted to see fail. But it wasn't going to be easy. The road to redemption was steep, and Brad knew it would require sacrifices. Dwayne had been receiving mixed messages from his team. They had all but told him that he needed to get with the program if he wanted to keep his job. But something inside him pushed back. He wasn't going to let his values be compromised for ratings. As if the universe had conspired to help him make up his mind, Dwayne got a call that would change everything. It was Brad. "Dwayne, I need to meet with you," Brad said, his voice sounding more urgent than usual. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said to me, and I think it's time for me to come clean. I'm done pretending. I need to do something real, something that matters." Dwayne was taken aback. "Brad, what are you talking about?" "I don't know exactly what it is yet," Brad admitted, "but I'm going to try something different. Something that won't just be about me trying to fix my image. It's about changing the conversation. I want you to be a part of it." Dwayne paused. He wasn't sure if this was a good idea. Their history wasn't exactly smooth. But there was something about Brad's tone, something real, that made Dwayne listen. "I'm not sure how we can make this work, Brad," Dwayne replied. "You've got a lot to prove, and I'm not just going to jump into something without knowing the full story. But I'll meet you. Let's talk." Later that day, they sat across from each other in a quiet cafe. The tension between them was palpable. Both men had been through a lot, and their lives had taken very different turns since their last encounter. Brad was leaner, his face etched with the signs of sleepless nights and hard reflection. Dwayne, on the other hand, seemed composed, his demeanor calm but resolute. "I've been thinking about the direction my career has taken," Brad started. "I've spent so much time focusing on the wrong things, how to be liked, how to win back my audience. But I've realized that the only way forward is to be authentic. I've been chasing the wrong kind of success." Dwayne studied Brad for a moment. "You're right about that. I've been through something similar. It's easy to get caught up in the game, to forget why you started in the first place." "I know we've had our differences, Dwayne," Brad continued, "but I'm done playing the game. I don't know if I'll ever regain the trust of the people I've hurt, but I'm going to try to do something that actually matters. I don't want to be the guy who's constantly apologizing. I want to be the guy who's changing things for the better." Dwayne leaned back in his chair. "I get it, Brad, and I respect that. But you've got a long road ahead of you. If you want to do this, you need to show people you're willing to put in the work. It's not about words. It's about actions." Brad nodded, the weight of Dwayne's words sinking in. "I'm ready for that. I want to make things right. I want to help change the conversation, just like you've been doing." Dwayne studied him for a moment longer. "All right, let's figure out how we can do that. But I'm not going to pull any punches, Brad. This is real. No more pretending." Brad smiled, a genuine look of determination in his eyes. No more pretending. As Dwayne and Brad parted ways, both men were left to contemplate the next steps in their journey. Dwayne knew that his own path was about to get even more complicated, but he was resolved to stay true to his principles. As for Brad, he had taken the first step in redefining himself, not just as a journalist, but as a man who was committed to making a difference. The meeting had been a turning point for both of them. Dwayne was beginning to understand that the public didn't just want entertainment, they wanted real change. And Brad, for the first time in a long while, felt like he was on the path to earning back his credibility. But the road ahead was still unclear, and the challenges were far from over. Dwayne sat in the makeup chair, staring at his reflection in the mirror. The lights of the studio cast harsh shadows on his face, emphasizing the fatigue he hadn't been able to shake for days. His mind was racing, torn between his values and the pressure to please the network. The executive's words echoed in his mind. Controversy sells, Dwayne. If you want to stay relevant, you need to give the audience what they want. But Dwayne had never been one to follow the status quo. He had worked too hard to get where he was, not by catering to what was easy, but by staying true to himself. Now, it felt like he was standing at the edge of a cliff. He had a choice to make. Would he give in to the machine, or would he risk it all for the sake of authenticity? As he sat there, lost in thought, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Brad. "I need your help. Let's talk. This could be our chance to change everything." Dwayne's brow furrowed. He hadn't expected to hear from Brad, not after their last conversation. But something in his gut told him this was important. He tapped out a quick response. "I'm listening." Brad's message came in almost immediately. "Meet me after the show. We need to make a move. Together." Dwayne didn't hesitate. The timing felt right. Maybe this was the sign he had been waiting for. He needed to see what Brad was really planning. He couldn't make decisions in a vacuum anymore. The weight of the choices he faced was greater than just his own career. Brad had spent the last few weeks in hiding. After his failed attempts to rehabilitate his image, he knew he needed to come up with something different. His phone had been ringing off the hook with media requests, but he avoided them all. It was clear that the public was tired of his apologies, tired of hearing how sorry he was. It was time for action. And then, it hit him. The only way he could start fresh was to take a step that no one would expect, a step that would make people pay attention for all the right reasons. It wasn't about looking for forgiveness anymore. It was about creating a platform where truth could be spoken, where voices that had been silenced could be heard. Brad had a vision, and he wasn't about to let it die in the realm of possibility. He needed Dwayne's help, and he was ready to ask for it. The meeting was set. Brad would tell Dwayne everything, and together they could shake up the media landscape in a way no one had seen before. After the show, Dwayne found himself walking through the quiet backstage hallways, making his way to the meeting room. He had no idea what Brad was planning, but his curiosity was piqued. The thought of joining forces with someone like Brad, despite their past differences, was an intriguing prospect. Maybe it was exactly what both of them needed. Brad was already there when Dwayne walked in, sitting at the table with a stack of papers in front of him. His expression was focused, determined. "Sit down, Dwayne," Brad said, motioning to the chair across from him. "I've been thinking about this for a while, and I think it's time we made some noise. Real noise. Not the kind the networks want. The kind that actually matters." Dwayne raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." Brad leaned forward, his hands folded on the table. "What if we started a movement? Something that would challenge the very system we've both been a part of. We've seen how the media controls the narrative, how it's more about drama than truth. What if we could change that? We're both in a position to do something big, Dwayne." Dwayne's mind began to race. "I like where this is going, but what exactly are you proposing?" "I'm talking about creating a platform, an independent one, where we can have real conversations, where we can talk about the issues that matter without fear of being censored or pressured by the networks. I'm talking about starting something that would give people a voice, something that would cut through the noise and get to the heart of what's going on in the world." Dwayne sat back in his chair, processing the idea. It was bold. It was risky, but it was also everything he had been wanting. A platform where he didn't have to play by the rules, where he could speak his mind without compromise. A place where people could engage in real conversations without the filters of the media. I'm in, Dwayne said, his voice steady. Let's do it. But we'll need a strategy. We can't just jump into this without a plan. Brad nodded, a smile spreading across his face. Exactly. I've been thinking about that too. We start small, build a community of people who are tired of the mainstream narrative. We get influencers, thinkers, and activists who have something real to say. And we build momentum. Dwayne's excitement grew. He hadn't felt this invigorated in a long time. It was the kind of challenge he had been searching for. Something that could truly make a difference. We'll need resources, Dwayne added. And we'll need to be ready for the backlash. The networks won't take kindly to this. Brad's eyes narrowed, a hint of defiance in his gaze. Let them come. This is about more than ratings. It's about giving people a space to speak the truth. As the two men shook hands, Dwayne knew that they were about to embark on a journey that would push them both to their limits. The risks were high, but so were the stakes. They were about to disrupt the very system that had shaped their careers, and there was no turning back. For Dwayne, it wasn't just about making a name for himself anymore. It was about creating something lasting, something that would stand the test of time. And for Brad, this was his last chance, a chance to rebuild his life on his own terms. But as they moved forward with their plans, they knew that the road ahead would be fraught with obstacles. They would face opposition from all sides, and the media would be relentless in its attempts to tear them down. But neither Dwayne nor Brad was willing to back down. They had found common ground, and together, they would change the game. The excitement of their new venture was palpable as Dwayne and Brad gathered their small team in the conference room. The momentum was building, and they were ready to make their move. There was a sense of unity among them, a collective understanding that they were about to do something groundbreaking, something that could change the media landscape forever. We've got a lot to do, but we can't waste any more time, Dwayne said, standing at the front of the room. We're not just fighting for ratings. We're fighting for authenticity. This platform we're building isn't about us. It's about everyone who's been silenced, ignored, or misrepresented. Brad nodded, his expression intense. Exactly. We're going to give people a voice. But first, we need to make sure we have a strong foundation. We need influencers, activists, and thinkers who are willing to speak their truth. We need people who are ready to shake things up. The team, a mix of young digital strategists and media veterans, began to brainstorm. Ideas flowed freely as everyone rallied around the mission. But as the excitement grew, so did the pressure. There were a lot of unknowns, and no one was sure what would happen when they finally launched. We need to be ready for a fight, one of the strategists said, glancing nervously at the group. This kind of movement won't go unnoticed. The mainstream media will tear us apart if we're not careful. Dwayne looked at Brad, his gaze steady. We're ready for it. This isn't about being careful. It's about being real. The first step was setting up the website, a clean, sleek platform that would serve as the heart of their movement. It was designed to be an open space for discussions, debates, and personal stories. There would be no censorship, no filter, just raw, unfiltered truth. As the team worked tirelessly to get everything ready, Dwayne and Brad met with potential allies. They reached out to influential voices who had built a reputation for challenging the status quo. Activists, journalists, and celebrities who weren't afraid to speak out. The response was overwhelming. People were ready for something different. They were ready to support a platform that was about real conversations. But as they neared the launch date, things began to get more complicated. The first sign that things were about to get out of hand came the day before the launch. Dwayne was in his office, reviewing the final details of their plan, when he received an urgent call from one of their tech consultants. Dwayne, we've got a problem, the consultant said, his voice tight with concern. There's been some pushback from the networks. They're trying to shut us down before we even get started. Dwayne felt his stomach tighten. What do you mean? We haven't even launched yet. They've been sending legal threats, talking to our investors, trying to get them to pull funding. It's happening fast. We need to act now. Dwayne hung up the phone and turned to Brad, who had just walked into the office. We've got a serious problem. The networks are trying to shut us down before we even get started. Brad's face hardened. I knew this wouldn't be easy, but we're not backing down. Dwayne nodded, a sense of determination settling in. We're not, but we need to be prepared. If they go public with this, we'll need to respond quickly. As the days passed, the pressure from the mainstream media only intensified. Dwayne and Brad found themselves at the center of a growing storm. The networks weren't just trying to shut them down. They were attempting to discredit them entirely. The media began to paint them as troublemakers, as people who were trying to tear down the system that had made them famous. The headlines were relentless. Dwayne Johnson teams up with disgraced journalist Brad Miller to create new platform. Will it backfire? And are Dwayne and Brad trying to destroy the media? A look at their dangerous new venture. It was exactly what they had expected, and it was only going to get worse. Dwayne's phone rang nonstop. He received calls from old friends in the industry, each one urging him to reconsider. "You're making a huge mistake, Dwayne," one of them said. "This is career suicide." But Dwayne didn't flinch. "I've made my decision. We're doing this. It's not just about my career. It's about doing what's right." Brad, too, felt the pressure mounting. He was being called every name in the book, disgraced, washed up, and worse. But none of it fazed him. He had made peace with his past. Now, it was about making sure the future was different. The night before the official launch, Dwayne and Brad sat in a quiet conference room, reflecting on everything they had done so far. They knew that the next day would be the beginning of something huge, but they also knew it could all come crashing down if things went wrong. "I won't lie, Brad. I'm nervous," Dwayne admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. "This could either be the start of something incredible or the end of everything we've worked for." Brad leaned forward, his eyes unwavering. "We knew it was going to be hard, but we're doing this for the right reasons. We've got something real here, Dwayne. People are ready for it." Dwayne nodded slowly. "You're right. I'm in. All the way." They shook hands, a silent agreement passing between them. Tomorrow, they would launch, and nothing was going to stop them. The day had arrived. As the clock ticked down to the official launch, Dwayne and Brad watched as the site went live. The first wave of visitors came flooding in, and their social media feeds exploded with comments, likes, and shares. It felt surreal, but as the excitement built, so did the tension. The mainstream media quickly picked up on the launch, and the criticism came in fast and furious. Articles began to surface, questioning the legitimacy of the platform and attacking Dwayne and Brad's motives. The pressure was unrelenting, but amidst all the noise, something unexpected happened. The people, real people, started to speak up. They shared their stories, their struggles, their truths. The platform was becoming a space for real conversation, not the sensationalized drama the networks had grown so accustomed to. For Dwayne and Brad, it was the first victory in what would be a long and difficult battle. The road ahead would be filled with challenges, but they were no longer fighting alone. As the day came to a close, Dwayne and Brad sat back, exhausted but proud. They had launched something powerful, something that had the potential to change everything. But they both knew this was just the beginning. They had won the first round, but the war was far from over. The first 48 hours after the platform went live were a whirlwind. The site was bombarded with traffic, positive and negative. Social media exploded in a frenzy, with people praising their boldness, while others angrily denounced them for being reckless. Dwayne and Brad sat in a small conference room, glued to their screens, as the storm raged on. "Here we go," Dwayne muttered, watching the trending hashtags grow by the minute. Hashtag DwayneBradRevolution. Hashtag TruthHurts. Hashtag No More Censorship. It was a double-edged sword. The buzz was huge, but so was the backlash. Brad leaned back in his chair, rubbing his forehead. "This is more intense than I thought. We knew it wasn't going to be easy, but I didn't expect the media to go this hard. They're treating us like we've declared war on them." "It feels like we have," Dwayne replied, his voice steady. "But that's the point. This is about changing the system. They don't want that. They'll do whatever it takes to take us down." Dwayne's phone buzzed with another message from his publicist. "We need to talk. Your next interview is booked. It's going to be tough. Expect a grilling." He sighed, knowing exactly what kind of interview it would be. The media would twist everything to make them look like villains. The networks had already begun to spin the narrative. In their eyes, Dwayne and Brad were troublemakers, people who had betrayed the system that had helped elevate them to fame. Brad, too, was under fire. His past had come back to haunt him in full force. The network's smear campaigns painted him as a disgraced journalist who had lost his credibility. Now, his attempts at redemption were being met with scorn and disbelief. It didn't matter that he was genuinely trying to build something that could change the narrative. To the media, he was a liability. The next day, Dwayne found himself sitting in a studio with a notorious liberal TV host, Jessica Matthews, who was known for her confrontational style. It was clear that the interview was going to be an ambush. Jessica, with her signature smirk, wasted no time. "So, Dwayne, tell me," she began, leaning forward, "why should we trust you now? After everything that's happened in your career, why should the public buy into this new venture of yours?" Dwayne sat up straighter, his hands clasped together on the table. "I didn't ask you to trust me, Jessica. I'm asking you to listen, to hear something different than the same tired narratives the media feeds people. We're not here to pander to anyone's agenda. We're here to give people a platform to speak their truth." Jessica raised an eyebrow, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "A platform to speak their truth? And you think people are going to take you seriously after everything you've done? You've built your career on playing the system, Dwayne. And now, you want us to believe that you're suddenly going to change everything?" Dwayne's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. "I didn't build my career on playing the system, Jessica. I built it by being myself. The system may have helped me get to where I am, but I'm not beholden to it. I'm here because people deserve better. They deserve to hear the truth, even when it's uncomfortable." Jessica's eyes narrowed, but she wasn't ready to give up yet. "But don't you think you're being a little naive? You're going to go up against some of the biggest forces in the media, the same media that made you a star. Do you really think you're going to win this fight?" "I don't think we're going to win this fight," Dwayne replied calmly. "I know we will. People are tired of being lied to. They're ready for something new." The interview continued with Jessica pressing Dwayne at every turn, but he remained calm, sticking to his message. He wasn't just defending himself. He was defending the movement that was larger than him, larger than anything he'd ever done in his career. As the interview wrapped up, Jessica gave him one final shot. "Well, there you have it, folks. Dwayne Johnson claims he's going to change the media game. But can someone who's spent his entire career in the spotlight really step outside of it?" Dwayne didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence spoke volumes. Back at the office, Brad was pacing nervously. He had just watched the interview online, and he could tell that the media was about to turn up the heat. "They're tearing him apart," Brad said, his voice tense. "They're going to do everything they can to destroy this platform." Dwayne nodded. "Let them. We've already got what we need. The people are talking, Brad. We're getting the message out there. But is it enough?" Brad asked, his voice cracking slightly. "I don't know how much more of this we can take. We're risking everything." Dwayne looked at him, his expression hardening. "We've already come too far to back down. This is bigger than just us. This is for everyone who's been silenced." Brad was quiet for a moment before he spoke again. "I've lost everything before. I'm not afraid of losing it again, but I can't help feeling like we're playing with fire." Dwayne stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the city below. "Sometimes, Brad, you have to burn it all down to build something better. We're doing that right now." The weight of Dwayne's words settled in. They were standing at a crossroads. The battle they had started was just beginning, and there was no telling what would happen next. As the days passed, the pressure only intensified. The media continued to attack their platform, claiming it was nothing more than a publicity stunt. The networks began to label them as dangerous and untrustworthy. Dwayne and Brad were constantly in the spotlight, their every move scrutinized by an audience that was divided between supporters and critics. But in the midst of the chaos, something unexpected happened. The platform began to grow. People started to rally around it. They shared their personal stories of being silenced by the media, of fighting for their voices to be heard. And slowly, but surely, the movement started to gain traction. It wasn't going to be easy. The road ahead was filled with obstacles. But Dwayne and Brad knew one thing for sure. They were in this for the long haul, and they were ready to fight. In the wake of the media storm, Dwayne and Brad realized that they couldn't do this alone. They needed allies, people who would support their vision and help amplify their message. They began reaching out to influential figures from different industries who had also been pushed to the margins, people who had their own stories to tell. One by one, they began to form a coalition of like-minded individuals who were tired of the status quo. Together, they would challenge the narrative and prove that there was power in truth. As the chapter came to a close, Dwayne and Brad sat down for a meeting with their new allies. They had no idea what the future held, but one thing was clear. They were no longer fighting this battle alone. The storm had only just begun. The next few weeks were a blur of media interviews, social media storms, and mounting pressure from every direction. Dwayne and Brad had expected the backlash, but nothing had prepared them for the sheer scale of it. Every day, it felt like the walls were closing in. The mainstream media continued its onslaught, labeling their platform a dangerous experiment, while politicians took to the airwaves, denouncing their work as a threat to national security. The constant barrage was wearing on Dwayne. The heavy responsibility of leading this movement was starting to feel like a burden, one that he couldn't shake off. Every time he checked his phone or turned on the TV, another attack from the media seemed to be waiting. His public image, carefully crafted over the years, was crumbling under the weight of this fight. "I never imagined it would be like this," Dwayne muttered one night, looking out at the city skyline from his office window. "We're not just fighting for freedom of speech, Brad. We're fighting for our very existence." Brad sat across from him, his face drawn with exhaustion. "I know, but we've come too far to turn back now. It's not just about us anymore. It's about everyone who's been silenced." Dwayne ran a hand through his hair, frustration building. "I get that, but it feels like we're running out of time. They're coming for us from every angle. And no matter what we do, we're the villains in their story." Brad sighed, leaning forward. "Look, I know this is tough, but this is the price of change. It was never going to be easy. We just have to stay focused. We're doing the right thing." Dwayne nodded, but the weight of their mission was pressing harder on him with each passing day. It wasn't just the media. They were hearing from friends, colleagues, and even family members who were starting to question their decisions. The criticisms were more personal now, attacking their character and integrity. The tipping point came one morning when Dwayne received a call from an anonymous source. The voice on the other end was calm, almost detached, as they dropped a bombshell. "Dwayne, you're not going to like this," the voice said, "but there's a leak in your team. Someone's feeding information to the opposition. They're planning something big." Dwayne's heart raced. "What do you mean? Who's leaking?" "I don't know yet," the voice replied, "but they're building a case against you, Brad, and the entire platform. You need to watch your back. It's only a matter of time before they go public with it." The line went dead before Dwayne could ask any more questions. He turned to Brad, his face pale. "Someone's betraying us, Brad. I don't know who it is, but they're feeding information to the other side." Brad's eyes narrowed. "We need to find out who's behind this. We can't let them tear us apart from the inside." But who could they trust? Their team had grown rapidly, and with it, the risk of infiltrators. They needed to figure out who the mole was before it was too late. As the days passed, the pressure continued to build. The media attacks became more aggressive. Whispers about the leak spread like wildfire, and soon it was clear that their enemies were moving fast, preparing to strike. Dwayne and Brad knew they had to act. They couldn't sit back and let the opposition dictate the narrative any longer. But as they began to investigate the leak, they uncovered something much darker than they could have imagined. A former employee, a trusted ally, had been in contact with a prominent anti-media group, feeding them insider information and helping to create a series of false narratives designed to discredit the platform. But the betrayal didn't stop there. The leaks weren't just about the platform's inner workings. They were targeting Dwayne and Brad personally. Dwayne felt the weight of this betrayal cut deeper than anything else he had faced. The person who had undermined them had been someone they trusted completely. The emotional toll was greater than he had expected, and the sense of betrayal left him reeling. Brad was angry, but more than that, he was worried. This was a pivotal moment for them. If they couldn't control the narrative, their platform, and their careers would be over. "We can't let this get out," Brad said, his voice low. "We need to deal with this quietly. If the media gets wind of it, we're done." With the leak exposed, Dwayne and Brad knew they couldn't afford to sit idle. They immediately began damage control, launching a counteroffensive against the lies being spread. They released a statement calling out the betrayal, but without giving too many details that could fuel the media's fire. Instead, they focused on reinforcing their mission. This was bigger than any individual or internal conflict. The media, however, didn't let up. The news cycle quickly latched onto the story of the betrayal, using it to discredit Dwayne and Brad further. The scandal became headline news, with everyone questioning their ability to lead the platform. But there was one thing the media didn't expect: the support from their followers. As the backlash against Dwayne and Brad grew, so did the number of people rallying behind them. The platform's user base swelled, with more and more people signing up and speaking out in support of what they were doing. "We've got the people on our side, Brad," Dwayne said as they watched the numbers rise. "The people see the truth. And no matter how much they try to tear us down, we can't give up now." Brad smiled grimly. "We're not going anywhere." As the chaos raged on, Dwayne and Brad realized that they needed to take their fight to the next level. The leaks, the betrayals, the media attacks, they couldn't keep responding in the same way. They had to go on the offensive. It was time to start pushing back, not just through their platform but through every possible channel. They began planning a new series of high-profile interviews, leveraging their public personas to counteract the negative press. But they also knew they couldn't just talk, they had to act. They needed to show the world that the platform wasn't just a place for criticism. It was a place for real solutions, for real change. And so, they set their sights on an even bolder move. They weren't just going to fight the system, they were going to disrupt it entirely. As Chapter 20 draws to a close, Dwayne and Brad find themselves at a crossroads. The leak has shaken them to their core, but it has also galvanized them in ways they hadn't expected. They know that the road ahead will be even harder, but they also know that they are no longer fighting for just themselves. They are fighting for a cause much bigger than them. The platform is growing stronger, and their resolve is deeper than ever. But the real test is yet to come. With enemies both within and outside their ranks, can they stay the course and overcome the hurdles that lie ahead? The journey is far from over, and the stakes have never. The weeks following the betrayal were marked by a rising sense of urgency. Dwayne and Brad knew they couldn't afford to wait for the storm to pass. The platform's future depended on their next steps, and every decision they made carried the weight of their movement's survival. Everywhere they went, people recognized them. The pressure was relentless, the expectations high. Yet, with every challenge came a renewed determination, not just from Dwayne and Brad, but from their supporters as well. The backlash from the media was fierce, but something remarkable was happening. More and more people were waking up to the truth. Their followers, inspired by Dwayne's unwavering resolve, began to fight back in their own ways. Forums, social media accounts, and grassroots movements began popping up in support of the platform. They weren't just talking about the injustice. They were taking action, sharing their stories, and defending the platform against every slanderous claim thrown their way. Dwayne watched in awe as a tide of change began to swell beneath the surface. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the movement. It was about reclaiming a voice for everyone who had been silenced by the forces working against them. But just as things seemed to be turning around, a new challenge emerged. Their opposition was no longer content to just fight from the sidelines. They had decided to go on the offensive, pulling every dirty trick from their playbook. The smear campaigns against Dwayne and Brad reached new levels of intensity, and the attacks were becoming more personal. Brad clenched his fists as he read the latest headline. "They're coming for us harder than ever, Dwayne. This isn't just a political battle anymore. It's personal. They've turned this into a full-scale war." Dwayne rubbed his temples, exhausted. He knew the media would do anything to tear them down, but now it felt like they were cornered. The personal attacks were cutting deeper than they had anticipated. What hurt most was the smear campaign against Brad, painting him as a manipulative puppet master controlling Dwayne. It wasn't just about the platform. It was an attempt to destroy everything they had worked for. "We can't let them win, Brad," Dwayne said, his voice steady despite the mounting pressure. "This isn't just about our reputations anymore. This is about proving to the world that the truth will always rise above lies." Brad nodded. but there was a deep weariness in his eyes. How do we fight back against something like this? Every time we take a step forward, they knock us 2 steps back. Dwayne's eyes narrowed, a spark of determination flickering in them. We go on the offensive. They think they can control the narrative, but they haven't seen anything yet. We're not going down without a fight. As the days passed, the opposition's tactics became more sophisticated. They weren't just using the media, they were spreading misinformation, creating fake accounts, and manipulating public opinion. It was clear they were willing to do whatever it took to destroy Dwayne and Brad. But Dwayne wasn't about to let that happen. He knew this was the moment when everything would change. If they didn't act now, the platform could be lost forever. He and Brad began strategizing their next move with a sense of urgency. It wasn't enough to simply defend themselves. They had to strike back and show the world that they were in control of their own narrative. They planned their biggest move yet, an exclusive interview with a major news outlet where they would lay bare the truth about the media's manipulation, the personal attacks, and the political agenda behind their smear campaign. It would be a game changer, and they had to execute it flawlessly. As the date for the interview approached, tension mounted. The stakes had never been higher, and they both knew that this was the moment of truth. If they didn't make an impact now, their enemies would win, and everything they had fought for would be lost. But the closer they got to the interview, the more nervous Dwayne became. It wasn't just the weight of the interview itself. It was the overwhelming sense of responsibility that came with it. He was about to stand in front of millions of people and face down the very people who had been trying to tear him apart. There was no turning back now. The day of the interview arrived, and Dwayne and Brad were ready. They had rehearsed their talking points, prepared for every possible question, and made sure their message was crystal clear. But when they walked into the studio, the pressure hit them like a ton of bricks. The cameras were rolling, the lights blinding, and the host, the very face of the opposition, sat across from them with a smug smile, ready to tear them apart. "Dwayne," the host began, leaning forward with a knowing grin. "It's been quite a ride for you lately, hasn't it? Your platform has caused quite a stir, but many are questioning whether your movement is more about personal gain than about the cause you claim to champion. What do you say to that?" Dwayne took a deep breath, steadying himself. This was it, the moment where everything could change. He looked the host dead in the eyes and replied, his voice calm but firm, "You can call it whatever you want. But what we're doing here is bigger than any of us. We're fighting for the right to speak our truth. We're fighting for the people who've been silenced by the very systems that claim to protect them. And no amount of media manipulation will change that." The host scoffed, clearly expecting a more nervous or defensive response. But Dwayne wasn't backing down. "You've spent weeks trying to paint me and Brad as villains. You've tried to tear us apart with lies, but the people aren't buying it anymore. They're waking up, and they're seeing the truth. So, if you want to keep playing your games, go ahead. But know this, you're not going to silence us." The host stammered, momentarily caught off guard by Dwayne's unshakable confidence. But he quickly recovered, attempting to steer the conversation back to the smear campaign. Yet, Dwayne was in control now. He had taken back the narrative, and the world was watching. As the interview came to an end, Dwayne felt a sense of accomplishment he hadn't expected. He had stood his ground, exposed the truth, and, most importantly, turned the tide in the battle for control of the narrative. The backlash from the media didn't stop immediately, but something had shifted. The public's perception was changing, and it felt like the beginning of the end for the smear campaign. As Dwayne left the studio, he glanced at Brad, who was smiling, genuinely, for the first time in weeks. They had done it. They had fought back with everything they had, and it looked like it was paying off. But they knew the battle wasn't over. This was just the beginning. The opposition would regroup, and new challenges would emerge. But for the first time in a long while, Dwayne felt hopeful. They were on the right path, and they were going to keep fighting. The tension in the air was palpable as Dwayne and Brad prepared for the final confrontation. After weeks of battling against the media, personal attacks, and the betrayal from within their own ranks, they had reached a breaking point. But now, they were ready. Ready to face the truth. Ready to fight for everything they had worked for. And ready to bring their fight to the ones who had tried to tear them apart. The world had been watching their every move. Dwayne and Brad had come to realize something crucial. The battle was no longer just about the platform. It was about the fundamental principles of freedom, truth, and accountability. They weren't just defending themselves. They were defending a vision of a future where anyone could speak out, where voices weren't suppressed by the powerful few who controlled the narrative. As the days leading up to the final showdown approached, they worked tirelessly behind the scenes, gathering their supporters, ensuring their platform was prepared for whatever would come next. But there was one thing they hadn't fully anticipated: the depth of the opposition's willingness to go to extreme lengths to maintain control. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Everything had been falling into place. The interview had been a success. The public was starting to rally behind them. But then, just days before their final public appearance, they received word that the mole they had suspected all along wasn't just an inside leak. It was someone far more dangerous than they had imagined. Brad had been out of town, working on securing the platform's future when the news broke. Dwayne received a cryptic text from an unknown number. "Dwayne, it's over. They've infiltrated everything. The platform, the team, even your closest allies. The final blow is coming." The text was unsettling in its simplicity. Panic set in. Dwayne immediately called Brad, his voice thick with urgency. "Brad, we've got a problem. Someone on the inside has gone deeper than we thought. This goes beyond a mole. They've orchestrated something that's going to destroy us once and for all." Brad's voice crackled through the phone. "What are you saying? Who's behind this?" "I don't know, but I think we've been set up. We need to find out who's behind it before it's too late." Dwayne and Brad knew that they had very little time to uncover the truth. Their final appearance, the moment that would determine whether their platform survived or not, was just days away. Every move they made now had to be calculated. They couldn't afford any more mistakes. The pressure was immense. As they scrambled to find the traitor in their ranks, the opposition launched its final assault. News stories began circulating about uncovered financial discrepancies within the platform, supposedly linking Dwayne and Brad to some shady business dealings. It was a well-timed hit, designed to distract the public and take down their credibility once and for all. But Dwayne and Brad weren't backing down. They had come too far. Their platform had survived countless attacks, and now they were facing the biggest challenge of all. They knew they had to expose the truth, not just to the public, but to their team, their followers, and themselves. Who could they trust? And more importantly, who had betrayed them? The day of the showdown arrived. The air was thick with anticipation. Dwayne and Brad stood before the cameras, ready to deliver a final statement that would either save their movement or doom it to failure. But as the press conference began, Dwayne could feel a sense of unease in his gut. The final battle had begun, and the stakes were higher than ever. They took their seats at the front of the room, the lights blinding, the microphones in front of them like 1,000 eyes, waiting to capture their every word. The opposition had been preparing for this moment as well, and they weren't going to let Dwayne and Brad go down without a fight. But before the press conference even began, there was a shift in the air. An unexpected guest entered the room, someone Dwayne and Brad had never anticipated would show up. It was Sarah, the former employee they had once trusted, the one who had been leaking information to the opposition, the very same person who had nearly destroyed everything they had built. "Sarah, what are you doing here?" Dwayne's voice was a mixture of disbelief and anger. Sarah walked toward the stage, her face grim. "I'm here to tell the truth. The real truth." Brad stood up, his body tense. "What do you mean? You've been behind the leaks, haven't you?" Sarah hesitated, glancing at the room full of reporters before speaking again. "Yes, I've been feeding information to the opposition. But it wasn't just about the platform. There were bigger forces at play, forces you didn't see coming. There's more to this than you know, Dwayne. I was just a pawn. You've been fighting a war you didn't understand." The room fell silent as the weight of her words sunk in. Dwayne felt a chill run through him. Had they been played all along? Had everything they fought for been part of a much larger game? As Sarah continued to speak, the truth began to unfold. The betrayal wasn't just about one person's greed or ambition. It was about a system that had been working to destroy their platform from the inside out. It was about manipulating public perception, controlling information, and suppressing voices that threatened the status quo. Dwayne and Brad listened, shocked by the depth of the conspiracy. But in that moment, they realized something. No matter how many times they were knocked down, no matter how many betrayals they faced, they could not allow themselves to be defeated. This was their fight, and they had come too far to stop now. With newfound determination, Dwayne stood up, looking straight into the cameras. You can try to destroy us, you can try to silence us, but you will not succeed. We will fight for the truth, no matter what it takes. And this is just the beginning. The crowd erupted into applause. Their words had struck a chord. The truth was out there now, and there was no turning back. The battle had been long, and the road ahead was uncertain. But Dwayne and Brad knew that they were not alone. They had their supporters, their followers, and each other. They had faced the darkness, and they had emerged stronger for it. They weren't just fighting for a platform anymore. They were fighting for the future. And the final showdown was theirs to win. In the months that followed, Dwayne and Brad's platform became a symbol of resilience and freedom. The fight was not over, but they had taken the first step toward changing the world. The battle for truth had been hard-fought, and the consequences of their actions were still being felt. But as they stood together on the front lines of a new movement, they knew that they had done something powerful, something that would echo through the years to come. And so, the story of Dwayne and Brad's fight was not just about one battle. It was about a new era, a new dawn for those willing to stand up, speak out, and refuse to be silenced. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?